either now or at some point later on in the course, is going to have exactly the same question. So you're doing me a favor by helping me know how to teach you better, but also you're helping your fellow classmates as well, and certainly you're helping yourself. So in lesson 2, we're going to be talking about the define phase of the project. So the first lesson we talked through was really all about an overview, a structural overview of Six Sigma. And we talked about a lot of definitions of different terms and phrases, which if your head isn't spinning out, that's a little bit of a surprise. For most people it probably is. And that's okay, because we'll go through all of that information in more depth and more detail. And as we go through that material, then the understanding of what it all means and how the pieces fit together will be clarified, and they'll come into better focus, I think. So let's go through the define phase. So after completing this lesson, you'll be able to explain the various components of project identification. You'll be able to describe customer data collection methods, list various means of project documentation, discuss risk analysis and management, describe project management and planning tools. You'll be able to explain the concepts used in evaluation of project performance. You'll be able to discuss team stages and dynamics. So the first piece of the define will be project identification. And so for anybody thinking about a potential project, we need to think about and check whether or not the project actually qualifies to be a Six Sigma project. So there are certain questions that you'll need to be asked, and some of those questions are listed here. Is there an existing process? Is there a problem in the process? Is the problem measurable? Does the problem impact customer satisfaction? And when we say customer, I don't just mean an external customer, I also mean internal customers. Does working on the problem impact profits of the company? Maybe another way to state that is, does working on the problem impact an issue that is critical to the company's success? Is the root cause of the problem unknown? Is the solution unknown? Now, if there isn't an existing process, then you probably wouldn't be looking at a DMAIC project. You'd be looking more at a design for Six Sigma project, where you need to go out and develop and create a new process. A lot of the same tools, just a little bit different roadmap. Is there a problem in the process? Well, I would think that if there wasn't, you'd be, why would you want to work on that in the first place? Is it measurable? If it's not measurable, how are you going to be able to figure out whether or not you've gotten any better? Saying something like, I think we should invest all of this money and all of this time, not only my time, but these other people, and put a project together, and at the end of it say, well, see, things seem to be much better. People are feeling pretty positive. When I walk around, I'm seeing more smiles. That's pretty soft stuff. I don't know that I would want to invest my resources in something as soft as that. I'd want something a little bit more tangible. And so if I was pitching a project because I believed it was important, I'd find a way to measure that in some respect. And so if it was something that was currently intangible, I'd probably try to develop something that could address it, and at the end of it be able to say, we improve from here to there. Does the problem impact customers? If it doesn't, again, why are you working on it? Is there another reason that's compelling? If there is, then it's fine, but you need to be able to understand that and define that. If you already know the root cause of the problem, why haven't you fixed it? If you know the solution, certainly you should have just fixed it. So these are some of the things that you should be asking yourself. And it's important for this to be done because I can assure you that over the course of your career, particularly if you get involved in Six Sigma, that when you see enough projects, from time to time you're going to have people pitching things because they have a preconceived solution in mind and they want to validate or justify that solution through the use of the Six Sigma project. That's probably not a very robust approach to taking projects on. You really should be working on things that are critical to the organization, that are really important to the business. If somebody wants to use the Six Sigma name to validate something a pet project or something that they have a presupposed solution for, that's probably going to end up being a problem. And it becomes important because at some point it's going to no longer justify an investment of other people's time and resources. At some point, one of your team members will have conflicting priorities, and when the project is challenged, it's not going to have, you're not going to be able to provide the answers that are needed to continue that person's involvement, and the project will fall apart. So again, you've got to make sure that it really is a legitimate issue that's important to the business, that there's an impact that's going to be positive impact that's going to be generated from the project, that you don't have an answer in mind already, you don't know the solution. Again, if you know the solution, you know the problem, following the Nike approach, speaking, what will happen is this, that someone at a senior level in the organization will say, well, gosh, we're hearing from customers that they can't get their product or the service in a timely manner, or it isn't consistently delivered in the manner in which they expect it to be delivered, or there's some issue we're hearing from our customers. And when we've looked into it, we've found some issues here that we think might be a problem. Maybe we've got high turnover of employees, and so we've got a lot of new and experienced people doing jobs that they're not yet really fully qualified or competent at. They're still learning. Maybe the process to produce that product or service is flawed, or there could be any number of issues. But we've decided to put a team together, and here are the people that we believe that should be involved. We've identified 6 to 8 people. They cover the process. We've identified a project leader. This is going to be the belt that's leading the project. This department manager or this director or executive director or VP, this is going to be the sponsor for the project. This is the individual that ultimately champions the project and has the positional authority and a vested interest in seeing the success of the project, to not only hold the belt accountable for delivering the likelihood of happening. Organization's goals or whatever happens to be important to that particular business or organization. Now, benchmarking is one of those tools that we might use where we want to look at a process and compare it to an organization someplace else. Maybe it's within the business, it's a different department, in a different location. Maybe it's a competitor that we are going to try to figure out a way to benchmark, although that can be very difficult. Maybe it's a different business, but they do the same work in some respect, or they have the same fundamental issue. In any ways, in any form, there are a number of different types of benchmarking, but it's a very, very good way to learn without having to reinvent the wheel. So some of the different types of benchmarking, we've got process benchmarking, where we'll compare specific processes to a leading company or an industry standard. Financial benchmarking, a detailed financial analysis and comparison along with information on overall competitiveness and productivity. We've got performance benchmarking, where we'll do a comparison of products and services with those of competitors. You know, Pepsi Challenge a number of years ago would be an example of that. Product benchmarking, designing new or upgrading existing products and services. We've got strategic benchmarking, studying strategies and problem-solving approaches in other industries. Functional benchmarking, focused analysis of a single function with the aim of improving it. Competitive benchmarking, where we benchmark organizational strategies, processes, products, services, and procedures against the competitors. And collaborative benchmarking, benchmarks carried out by a group of companies where information is shared. So these are different types of benchmarking. Again, if you've got a challenge within your business and you've got some element of that project that you might be doing where rather than having to reinvent the wheel or figure out what you do, if somebody else has that same challenge, there are things that you can do to shortcut that analysis by saying, look, fundamentally, you know, XYZ, they had the same issue we did. You know, maybe they're in a completely unrelated industry, but they have the same problem shipping to customers that ordered online and getting it to them in a timely manner. And, you know, they were doing this, but we're doing that, but they had the same problem. They figured it out. Now they're kind of an industry leader in their particular realm, and they would be determined to be, let's say, best in class. Maybe we can talk to them and they can, you know, help us. Maybe there's a synergy there. Maybe we've got some strengths that they can learn from as well, so we can help each other that way. So lots of opportunities, and the team is really has a tremendous opportunity at the beginning of a project to think about, and throughout the course of the project, I suppose, as well, to think about who else might have the same issue that we might be able to learn from. If they've already had to work out all the bugs and figure out all the challenges and they've gotten really good at it, rather, you know, even though it might have taken them a long period of time, maybe we can make that happen much more quickly without all the headaches by benchmarking what they're doing. So a very effective tool. I've certainly been engaged in a number of projects where benchmarking is used, and you know, always found it to be a very, very good, very useful learning opportunity. So best practice method of ensures continuous improvement leading to exceptional performance. Best practices to be followed while benchmarking are as follows. Increase the objectives or scope of benchmarking. Set the standards and path to be followed at the initial stage. Reduce unnecessary effort and apply with a scope. Recognize the best in the industry to set a benchmark. Share the information derived from benchmarking. So the best practices around benchmarking. Now when we want to select projects, there are 5 steps that we want to follow. We identify the organizational needs. So the organization needs projects to improve and develop its functional areas and serve and meet customer needs. Again, think about customer from both an internal and an external perspective. If I'm the finance department, I probably have internal customers. If I'm human resources, again, I probably got internal customers. There are certain departments and certain roles and functions within any organization that their customers are probably those individuals they work with, fellow employees, but they work at some other department or in some other function in the organization, and they're their customer. So who are our customers? As a human resources person, I would probably, you know, have things tasked like, I want to make sure that when I am asked to recruit for a position that I get all the right requirements, that I find the right person in a timely manner, that I'm able to make it easy for the hiring manager to make that decision and make the right decision, get the person hired as quickly as possible, it's the right person, all those sorts of things. So that hiring manager would probably be my customer if I was an HR person. Identify the projects. So we want to identify projects that are aligned with the organizational need. Again, what keeps you up at night? Is it a pet project, or does someone have a presupposed solution that they're trying to push forward? Do they have some type of an agenda? You have to be careful about that. Despite best intentions, sometimes those types of initiatives are put forward, so we have to safeguard ourselves, make sure that that work that we take on really is the right work for the business or the organization. We want to evaluate potential projects. So we'll look at different things like the net present value, cost-benefit ratio, the internal rate of return, opportunity cost, payback period, and so on. we're evaluating the potential projects based on criteria that are important for the organization. These are all financial. There are probably going to be other metrics or other issues that are important for us as well. Do we have the right people that can be involved in the project? Might be one of them. Do they have the expertise and the skill? Is this something we should be keeping in-house or outsourcing? Is this, all those sorts of considerations, and there are probably any number of them from organization to organization. You probably have different ones, but these are pretty standard ones that are, they're probably going to be at least part of most organizations' evaluation. It's not an all-encompassing or comprehensive list, but it's some of the stuff that we'd be looking at. Want to select the project. So the project that meets the organizational requirement is selected and initiated. And then the project will be reviewed to ensure alignment to the organizational goals. So we go through these 5 steps to make sure that when we put a project team together and we pull people to be on the project team, now the project leader, as a green belt, you might be spending, I don't know, 20, 30, 40% of your day, or your time at least. You might work on 1 day a week, might be a couple, half a day, a couple of times a week. Some period of time throughout the course of your day would be working on the project. You're also going to have team members. You don't do all the work yourself. You'll do a lot of it, but you'll have team members there as well. So you might decide to have team meetings, once a week for an hour or 2 hours. When it's appropriate. Maybe it's every other week. Maybe it's twice a week. Whatever the circumstances happen to be. And it varies from project to project and organization to organization. There's no hard and fast rule that says you shall have 1 team meeting a week and it shall be 1 hour. Whatever makes sense. But it's important that the belt doesn't do all of this stuff on their own. That they do delegate and make sure that the subject matter experts that comprise their team participate and contribute as well. Not only do you need their expertise, their know-how, and their insight, but you also need their buy-in. And if they aren't part of the process and they haven't contributed in a meaningful way, they might not buy into it. So that's so critical. So being able to justify their team or their time, participating on that project is something that you'll have to be able to validate and justify. So if you've got team members that are putting in some time on the project as well, and maybe you've got to travel to do a benchmark or a site visit or something else, meet with potential suppliers, then there could be some costs associated with that. It doesn't make sense. Is it a good investment to work on this project? Or is there other stuff we should be working on instead? Now, some definitions that we should go through. The terms process, and business systems are defined as follows. So we've talked a lot about process, and we'll talk more about it as well. It's a series of steps to produce a service or product. It consists of inputs, the process step itself, and the output. So an example might be payroll department in a human resources department or in human resources in an IT. Now, on one of the earlier slides this morning, I mentioned the acronym SIPOC, and I said fairly quickly that it represented supplier input, process output, and customer. It's a way to map out your process and list all of the elements that are associated with it. So, for example, if you were to go process step, if I was washing a car, I'd have to rinse off the car, apply the soap, and wipe and clean the car. I'd have to rinse it off again and maybe dry the car. So a pretty simple process, maybe 4 or 5 steps. That would be that center block there. This is process, set of steps which transform the inputs into outputs. Now going to the far left-hand side, we have the supplier. So a person or organization providing resources to the process concerned. They provide the stuff. They provide the inputs. So things like information, material, or services provided by the supplier. It goes into that process step that I mentioned a moment ago. Something happens, it's changed or transformed, something's going on. It creates an output. That's the result. Whatever's happening does something, and that something becomes the output. It's the final product or service or outcome of the process. That happens at each step. So each step along the way until the very end. At the very end, you should have a clean car. The ultimate, first input would have been, a dirty car, and the final output would have been a clean car. Along the way, inputs would have been things like, your water pressure, the type of soap you're using, the type of sponge you're using, who the washer was, all those sorts of things. They're your inputs. And the customer is the person, process, or organization which uses that output. So you might have the driver, the individual that owns the vehicle. That's your customer. So it's a good way to map out all the elements of your process. It's also a very good learning opportunity for the team because you have subject matter experts and team members that may not have had exposure to the full scope of the process before. And so being able to map it out from start to finish, suddenly they have this insight into and visibility to all of the stuff that happens, not only that, before it gets to them, but also what happens after it leaves them. Understanding that from a holistic perspective, what's going on in the business and how the pieces fit together, that's invaluable insight. Now, one or more changes in supplier input or process actions are likely to, they're going to result in a change in the process output. So if those SIPs, supplier input and or process actions, SIP, are stable, the output will be stable. Relations between the SIPs and output provide a method to define possible cause-effect relationships. Those relationships can be termed as closed-loop business systems. So here we see that supplier input, process output. So here's an example of a SIPOC form for a call center. So suppliers would be, in this instance at least, telecom industry, IT industry. Inputs would be things like the phone connection, computer or system, the headset, server or dialer, customer service rep, or TSR, telephone service rep, presumably. Now, I would recommend as you're going through this with your team members that you try to state your inputs in a measurable way. So maybe your computer or system, which system are you talking about? Maybe there are multiple systems. Name your system. Your headset, what's the brand or what's the type of headset? Your server or dialer, again. Your customer service rep, maybe the individuals, their names. You want to make sure that these are in some way measurable. Might not be a number, might be a word, but that way you can do some analysis later on that will make this much more effective. We'll get to that later on. Your process might be the opening call, customer verification, probing the customer, resolution, and closing. Your output would be problem solution. Customer would be the user, the existing customer, maybe it's a new user. And your project Y could be, maybe first call resolution. Can the customer assistance center, the call center in this instance, resolve my complaint or my issue on the first call? Or am I having to have somebody call me back, or am I getting transferred, or something going on that they're not able to? Maybe I set a hold for 15 minutes. Whatever your project objective has to be, we've mapped it out, and this is how we've done so. Now, the improvement of a business process of an organization is going to face challenges due to the traditional business system structure. So some of the challenges would be the product or service has to go through various functions and their functional elements to reach the customer. Management of the flow of products or services across various functional elements is difficult. So here you can see an example of that where you've got the board, you've got several functions, you've got the raw product going through a variety of steps before it becomes the product, and so on. So it can be a little bit complex and a lot of different pieces to this. A lot of opportunities, defect opportunities, I suppose, would be one way to put it. the more complex that is, the more challenging it can be to work in. It's another way to look at it. Now, owners and stakeholders are going to be critical to any project that you're looking at. And here we have an image that represents the process owner and stakeholders which have been placed in an organizational hierarchy. So we've got the process owner. That's the person who's responsible for the performance and execution of the process. It might be a department manager. So for example, if we were working to improve first call resolution in a call center, maybe it's a call center manager would be your process owner. And I would expect that that individual would be, obviously on your project team. The stakeholder, those people who are affected by the organization's actions, and they could be, stockholders, customers, suppliers, management, employees, society in general, the communities. So we need to know for any project we're working on, who's the process owner? Would it make sense to have the human resources manager or the VP of HR in charge of a call center project? No. Does the VP have positional authority to do stuff? Yes. Do they have a vested interest? Probably not. With the call center manager, presumably they would have positional authority, at least if not, maybe their boss would, in which case they'd be the sponsor, but they would certainly have the vested interest, as would their boss. And if they're managing it on a day-to-day basis, they would be the process owner. They may also be the sponsor, depending on their level of hierarchy in the business. Now, it's important to know who your stakeholders are because your project has an impact on them, and so they need to be involved in some respect. You need to be in some type of communication with them. You have to be careful, of course, what you're communicating, depending on who the stakeholder is, but you need to be able to make sure that they're not surprised in a bad way, by stuff. Now, certainly with your customers, one of the things I've seen a lot of organizations miss on is where they've done stuff based on customer feedback, but they didn't do a very effective job at communicating back to the customer that we've listened to you, we've heard you, and here's what we've done based on your feedback. Thank you very much. That way, the customers understand when they're surveyed periodically that what they have to say really does make a difference. It is important. That would be an example, that you'd want to maybe put it on your website, or maybe send out letters to customers periodically, or publish it in some way. Failure to meet one or more process objectives, it may result in negative effects on the stakeholders. Yeah, and certainly you don't want to surprise people in a bad way. That never has a very good ending, or certainly it makes things far more challenging for everybody involved and can be quite uncomfortable. As an example, stockholders, reduction in perceived value for the company. I was noticing the stock market at lunch today was way, way down. There were a couple of large organizations that had missed their targets and surprised investors. Make life very difficult for you and your employees. They'll be loud and boisterous in their complaints, and they won't, if they're always, when they call your employees, they're always difficult to manage, and they complain and they yell and they carry on, you end up having high turnover, stressed employees. They'll cost you in other ways. It's called bad profits. Suppliers may face delay in receiving their pay or non-payment issues. You want to view your suppliers as partners. Management require cost cut down. Employees will receive diminishing wages. Maybe employee morale will decrease. That's an intangible, except that you could probably measure employee morale if you did some type of a survey with your employees about employee engagement, and you ask the right questions. So you want to thoughtfully design some type of a survey or questionnaire and distribute it amongst your employees, and of course you encourage them to complete it and assure them that their feedback will be looked at and addressed in a safe way, of course, maybe it's done anonymously, and then of course the organization would have to figure out a way, what are they going to do, what do they need to do, how are they going to communicate that back to employees that, hey, we've listened to you, we've done these things, and so on. And the society may experience pollution due to the organization. So negative impacts from the project or any of your work can impact your stakeholders. It's important to start by saying who are our stakeholders, what is their vested interest in the work that we're doing, what are some possible ways that they could be impacted positively or negatively. Let's be able to put some contingency things in place so that if negative things could arise, that they're at least not surprised by them, or that the effects are mitigated as best as possible. Business stakeholder relationship, as we look at this Venn diagram, it's kind of a Venn diagram that we're looking at. We've got owners or stockholders, we've got suppliers, customers, management, employees, internal company processes kind of in the middle with all that overlap. So all these pieces they're not separate, independent elements of your project or your business. They're all interrelated. It's important to understand that relationship. And it sounds like I might be stressing it a lot. It's because I can assure you that if it's missed in a project and things go sideways on you, it can become uncomfortable. So better to protect yourself on the front end and at least be prepared so things are more likely to be successful. The stakeholder analysis is going to be an important task, and it's going to be done before doing a Six Sigma project. As a business has a lot of stakeholders, and any change to a business process affects some or all of them. You need to understand what they are. When a process doesn't meet its objectives, it results in the stakeholder being negatively affected, which in turn impacts the organization's performance. So the team needs to factor in the reasons why a stakeholder may oppose the change efforts. And I've certainly seen projects where stakeholders were brought in as extended team members. They didn't sit in on every meeting. There were certainly meetings that would maybe discuss confidential information that they weren't shouldn't be privy to, but their input and insight was important at certain junctures, even if it was just as a sounding board to present what we had found to that point and get their feedback on it. So they had some, greater buy-in, and we didn't miss the opportunity to address any issues that maybe we didn't see ourselves, but our stakeholders could point them out to us. Sometimes it's customers, sometimes it's suppliers, sometimes it's somebody else, one of the other groups. But again, there's no harm in having somebody come in periodically and you present your work, or at least have conversations with them about your work and get their feedback on it. Customers, by the way, will be extremely pleased to do that. They'll also be surprised, but in a good way. Now, the second piece of the define phase is the voice of the customer. They're the most important part of any business. So let's define a customer as being someone who decides to purchase, they pay, they consume, and they get affected by a particular product or service. And this last bullet point, or this last statement on the slide, is really, really important, and something I think a lot of times project leaders and team members miss. Two types of customers. They're both internal and external. It's essential to identify and understand the customer requirements so the products or services can be designed according to those requirements. Again, not every project will view its customers as being the end user of the product or service. There are often projects when projects are done, and when they look at who their immediate customer is, it's someone that sits maybe in an office or a cubicle or a desk or someone else within the organization. Again, if the organization has determined that there's some type of high-level issue, and as you break it down, you understand that, gosh, part of the problem for this, at least the biggest chunk that we can see, is that it's taking us too long to hire new employees when we have turnover, and gosh, it seems like we have a lot of high turnover in a certain area of the business. We need to do an HR project to figure that out. The HR department would probably not view the paying customer down the road as their immediate customer, although they be aware of it, probably want to understand that a little bit. their immediate customer might be the department that is having this high turnover. So who is your customer? You need to know that. An internal customer is anyone within the business who is affected by the product or the service while it's being developed. I can tell you that I am routinely, maybe bombarded is a strong word, but it's probably fairly accurate, bombarded by organizations that want to survey me for some reason. Hard to go to a restaurant and not have a survey or some type of a comment card come with the bill. Almost always does. You go to some kind of a session, you get a customer satisfaction or some type of a survey as well. You buy some article of clothing and maybe the company wants to survey you there. They're all around us. I don't know that I've ever experienced someone within my organization coming to me and saying, hey, I know this is what you do and you rely on whatever I do to do your job better. How am I doing? What could I do better? I don't know that I've ever experienced that. So that's an opportunity for you to, I think, in a good way, again, surprise some people in your business. Find out. And your team members, as you work on your project, should maybe consider, if you have internal customers, how can you better serve them? Because at the end of the day, there's a saying, if you're not serving the end customer, you're serving someone who does. The work that you do to serve your internal customers ultimately has an impact on what the external customer receives as well. So needs of an internal customer, necessary tools, training, specific instructions, provision of company newsletters, projects, storyboards, etc., awards and recognition. Some of these are tangible, some of them are intangible. How an employee feels might sound intangible, but you can probably measure that. You can probably come up with a survey or some type of a measurement tool to determine how positively or how negatively they feel about things, what they find that they need or aren't getting to do their job effectively, and all those sorts of things. You might find that one of the drivers would be things like more thoughtful recognition of the good job. A lot of times people get called in for an employee performance appraisal, and their supervisor, their boss, will talk about the stuff over the very recent period, or they'll have saved a bunch of stuff for the since the last one, a year, let's say, before, and they'll just kind of dump on you. That's probably not a very positive experience. And so you might find that a more effective approach would be to do things in more real time, when someone does something well, or maybe there's a coaching moment. So these are the needs of an internal customer, and you want to go about finding out, if you have an internal customer, what are their needs? You have to ask them. Now, the importance of an internal customer, the activities directly impact the final customer, either directly or down the road. Activities affect the next process in the system. That's what I mean by down the road. And they affect the quality of the end product. Again, remember that first pass yield. Letters, awards, recognition, constant training, competitive environment, things that might be important or of value to your internal customers. External customers are not part of the organization, but they're impacted by it. They're the sources of revenue for the business system and therefore extremely important. Customers always have a choice. Three types of external customers. They're the immediate customers, so they purchase a particular product or service. They modify or assemble, repack, resell the product or service to an end user. End users, they purchase a particular product or service for their personal use. And affected parties, they don't purchase the product or service, however they're impacted by it. So it might be that General Motors is buying components from some organization that they put into their buses. The bus then goes to, let's say, a dealership, GM dealership, who sells it to maybe a school district. That might be how it has an impact. And of course, if you're making components for that bus, you've got your immediate customer, or intermediate customer, I should say. You have end users and affected parties that you'd probably want to understand their needs as well. The better you understand the details, the better able you will be to deliver what's of value. Most important aspect of any process improvement is the customer. So some of the positive impacts of the project on both types of customers, we have things like, for an internal customer, high levels of motivation, high level of job satisfaction, undertake additional roles and responsibilities, focusing on delivering their responsibilities, improve team bonding. People are excited to go to work. You can see it. People seem, they're happier, they're smiling more, they're lots of camaraderie. Now, some of the ways you could measure it, of course, would be the engagement, which we've talked about. You might find that there's less absenteeism. You might find higher productivity levels with, correlated to higher engagement. You might find, if it's something you can measure, customer satisfaction for a call center employee, for example, might be higher with those employees that are engaged. So you might be able to measure it directly that way as well. Effects on the external customer, solutions to their problem. At the end of the day, did you solve their problem, whatever that happened to be? You've got a better product for them. Requirements are effectively met. Improved customer service, customer satisfaction, really customer loyalty. What is it about the experience that will cause this customer not only to come back, but probably bring their friends with them next time? Walt Disney once said about, we want our guests not only come back, but to bring their friends with them. Now, we've talked about data. I think most people, when they hear the word data, think about numbers. But data is really just information. And it can be numbers, it can be quantitative, but it can also be qualitative. So collecting data from customers is going to be really essential because it helps you understand and consider the levels at which customers impact the business. Customer data or feedback collected from internal and external customers, and collecting customer data helps to fill the gaps and improve the various business processes in the organization, to define a good quality product as perceived by the customer, to identify qualities that make the competitor's product or service better, and to identify factors that provide a competitive edge to the product or service. So some of the different methods that are probably more common are things like surveys that are conducted through questionnaires, focus groups, individual interviews with a customer, direct feedback from customers through call center data, emails, and feedback forms, and so on. So lots of different ways to collect feedback from customers. In addition to, let's say, a customer satisfaction score, how satisfied were you with, the recent item you just purchased from us, to that Net Promoter Score, the likelihood to recommend, or how easy were we to do business with. On a scale of 0 to 10, you get the number there as well, but quite often those surveys also include some qualitative feedback. What's the main reason you gave that score? What could we do to improve the score and or to become easier to do business with? Those sorts of questions that are open-ended. You never want to say why, by the way, because it puts people on the defensive. So, what's the main reason rather than why do you give us a 5? What's the main reason you gave a 5? And the person can be, well, they're not put on the spot, they don't feel defensive, but they also are given an opportunity to elaborate and explain the rationale and to give great information. That's data, by the way. Even though you might have a bunch of words, that's data. And that's often more valuable because it can help drive the improvements. Knowing what your customers in aggregate want is invaluable. Lots of ways to collect it again, as we've talked about. So questionnaires can be given out in the form of a survey. So it's one method of deriving feedback from individuals through structured questions, either personally or over email, telephony, etc. And some of the steps might be this. What scope? Figure out and determine the scope of the survey. So initially plan the scope of the survey. Make a list of all the points that need to be covered. Excuse me. We'll define the survey group, plan the participants required for the survey, pick methodology. So depending on the time, the budget, the demography of the participants, decide on a survey methodology. Develop a questionnaire. So you want to develop a brief, professional, neat questionnaire to encourage effective participation. And then you're going to cut the compilation piece, scan the questionnaires and develop a report. So we've all stayed at, well, some of us have probably stayed at a hotel that sent us a survey at the end of this. I stayed at one particular hotel where I was a frequent guest and had a loyalty card. And I got a survey and had a pretty good experience, and so I decided to take the survey. I don't always. This instance, I did decide to take the survey and opened it up. 84 questions later, I finally completed the darn thing. Well, yes, I completed it, but I can assure you that I didn't do another one for that hotel unless I was really, really happy or really, really upset about something. It was just too long. So in that case, it's probably a flawed survey, or it's biased because there's so many questions, you're losing too many people. Too many people will not fill it out, and those people that do are either, like me, I was naive the first time, but after that, it was either because I had an extreme reaction. So you have to be careful about, scoping the survey. Who are you going to do it to, and how many questions, and what are the questions you're going to ask, and so on. You need to keep it, brief enough that people will complete it, but also ask questions in a more surgical manner so you can collect the information you really do need. If it's nice to have, don't ask it. If you need it, then ask it. Pretty good rule of thumb that I've found to work well. And of course, after you've completed the survey, then you can then you review the report or the survey results, and you can develop a report on the findings. Some advantages and disadvantages of the questionnaire are listed below. So some of the advantages of a questionnaire would be lowest cost approach, phone response rate 70 to 90%. It varies, and I think that over time these numbers are decreasing because of the proliferation of surveys. So looking at survey rates today, I see different numbers being reported than I saw a year ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago. The numbers are decreasing somewhat. I think it's just so many different organizations are doing surveys. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice here. So fewer people are taking the time to respond because they're being inundated with surveys. But you do get fast results by phone. In this instance, analysis of mail questionnaires require few trained resources. Some disadvantages: incomplete results, unanswered questions leading to a lack of clarity. Mail response rate 20 to 30%. That's a pretty positive number. I'm seeing today mail response rates to be lower than that, but it varies. There is a lot of variation, and some of that is dependent upon the industry, and some of it's dependent upon the brand loyalty. So, for example, there are some companies out there that, like a John Deere or an Apple. So what this slide is really saying is this: you've got a few different approaches. Whether you conduct a survey by mail, by email, by telephone, or some other manner, you go out and you collect some information. Depending on the type of approach you take, there are different costs associated with that. Put a letter into an envelope and a stamp on it and get a low response rate. It's expensive. Paying someone so many dollars per hour or so much per survey. If you have a high response rate, it might be a little bit less expensive, but there are also some things to be aware of. And it's that, if you do a survey by mail, it's going to be, consistent across the board, or more likely to be, designed to be at least, unless there's some ambiguity to your questions. But when you do it by phone, depending on the conversation, the interviewer can have an influence on the interviewee. So you have to be very careful there as well. So you have to be thoughtful about how you conduct your survey. It's an invaluable approach, and certainly something most organizations today are doing, and it's a good thing. But again, if it's not done appropriately or thoughtfully, it can create some harm. You never, ever want to create harm. So just be thoughtful about it and look to see who's doing it well and maybe adopt some of their best practices. As we go through some of the details and we look at a telephone survey, it's used for a general survey when the sample size consists of a generic population, typically inexpensive and can be conducted in a limited time. Clarification of some answers is possible in some instances, and other times they won't. It depends on who's conducting the survey. But you have the flexibility at least. Open-ended questions can be asked. More respondents tend to respond to a telephone survey than other types. There might not be enough audio-video support, so the data quality can be low. Compilation and analysis of data consumes time. One of the things I've seen work well is where they'll, at the beginning, let the person know that the call might be recorded for training and quality purposes. Assuming the person says yes, that's fine, they'll ask some questions. Because not only does it validate the information that they're typing into a screen or onto a form that will get analyzed and maybe sent to someone in the organization if appropriate, but if they're doing for a department or a branch, they might send the survey responses for that department or that branch to that manager. They'll have a written form of it. But if the manager wants to go in and listen to those words in the customer's voice, they can do that as well. Web surveys used when surveys targeted at a specific set of people and when the sample size is easily accessible through the internet. It's low cost and respondents get enough time. Clarification for answers not possible. So at least it's not easy. Open-ended questions cannot be asked as easily. Less respondents respond, lower response rate typically. Although I've seen some organizations on a web survey that will send out a letter or even make a telephone call first to let them know they'll be getting a survey and asking them to take the time to respond because the information will be acted upon. That might be a high-level person that sends that letter or makes that phone call. Audio and video support is possible so the data quality is better. It simplifies the compilation and data analysis of data collected. Now, with each passing day, it seems that technology makes more and more advancement. And as that happens, the sophistication of surveying techniques improves as well. So what might be a constraint today for one type of survey might not be a constraint tomorrow. So it's always important to keep abreast of changes that are happening from a technological standpoint, because it might be that you choose to do one form of survey today because of this constraint that you want to avoid. Well, you might be paying a higher price for that, and there might be a technological advancement down the road that would eliminate that constraint. Focus groups, generally a small group of 3 to 12 individuals who assemble for 1 or 2 hours to explore specific topics and questions. Following are the steps in the process. So this preparatory stage, the planning stage, the session compilation. So you can see the work that takes place at during each phase. I will say that focus groups tend to be very expensive and that they aren't always a representative sample of the population. So in other words, when you do a survey, what you're really doing is taking a subset of your customer base, let's say, or of the population. You're taking a group of people and saying, we trust that this small sample or this small group represents the whole. So because we can't do a census, we can't talk to absolutely every customer or every individual that might buy from us, but we can talk to some of them. We're taking a sample of them. So we're trusting that that sample is large enough and has been stratified appropriately to be representative of the whole. That isn't always true with a focus group. And you'll remember, some of you might remember, this is going back into the 1980s, Coca-Cola knew that the Pepsi Challenge was on the level. Pepsi Challenge would have people come up and try a taste of Pepsi, and they'd have a taste of Coke, and they were, they didn't know what they were drinking. The cans were covered, and they would say, I like this taste better. And the vast majority of people picked Pepsi, saying, I like the taste of this drink. More than that, they'd lift off the cover, and lo and behold, it was Pepsi. Coca-Cola had done those taste tests on their own to validate it. They didn't trust it initially. They went out and they did some of their own, pretending to be the same people. They found that, yeah, actually people are preferring the taste of Pepsi over Coke. So they played with the formula and they tested it with a focus group. And the focus group found that, yeah, we like the taste of the new Coke better as well. They put it out there and it was just a fiasco, where there was so much backlash that Coke had to retreat and essentially withdraw their new taste of Coke by reintroducing classic Coke. So they put the old Coke back on the market, rebranded it as classic Coke. The regular new taste of Coke eventually went away. So it's important to remember that a focus group can give you a lot of very detailed information because you've got this relatively small group of people. You've got them all to yourself for 1 or 2 hours, let's say, and you can really go into the details and dive into the into the weeds, we'll say, to get some information and understand in a very detailed way. The problem is if it's not a representative sample, that your focus group can lead you astray. So you have to be careful there. A better thing might be if you're going to do a focus group to do that initially to get all the stuff you want, and then take the pieces away from it that you need to, and you can always survey based on that. Here are findings from the focus group, and then go do a survey on those findings to validate them as being accurate. And somebody listed most of them already. Now, interviewing, a technique of questioning and probing the individual to gather information. It's informal, typically informal. It encourages the interviewees to voice their opinion. Even though quite common for collecting customer feedback, it can be quite time-consuming. So here are the steps in the process, the introduction, the greeting, gather the feedback compilation. You start the session with a friendly greeting, you understand their background and so on, so good to know you, tell me about yourself. Avoid taking notes, display complete attention to what the participant has to say. After the session, make a list of points discussed. I'm going to offer my approach to doing this because I had a project that really sticks out where I was working with an organization that had merged with 2 other organizations. It was within a business unit of a large company. And essentially what happened was that different regions came together. And each of them went out and found their own and sourced their own suppliers. And I found that we were buying a lot of the same stuff, but from a lot of different people. In some cases, in other cases, we're buying them from the same people, but those suppliers viewed as a whole bunch of independent customers as opposed to one. And so bottom line was we weren't leveraging our size and our relative strength as a larger organization to get a better deal and better service from these suppliers. We also didn't have very good control mechanisms in place, so a lot of different people could buy a lot of different things without anything really preventing that from happening. So there were all sorts of problems. To tell you what to do, I knew that'd be a problem. And so if I had a conversation on the phone, I realized that without a rapport with the person, without that trust, without a relationship, it would be difficult to get candid, honest responses, and I'd be, fed the corporate line. So what I did was I actually got on a plane and I flew to different locations and branches and sat down face-to-face with people. Now, I would recommend that while it might be ideal to be able to pull out a tape recorder and put it on the table to capture verbatim, I can assure you that if you pull out a tape recorder, people will not be honest with you. They'll tell you what they want you to hear. So what I would typically do is I would have somebody with me that would sit off to the corner taking notes verbatim. So if the person I'm interviewing is saying, I'll use a technical term, this sucks, again, that's a technical Six Sigma phrase, means bad, that that's what they would write. They wouldn't put it in their own words. They would say exactly word for word what the customer or what the person being interviewed said. So they'd capture the notes, and again, they would sit off to the side quietly. I would sit having a conversation with the person. I find that to be much more effective than trying to take notes after the fact and remember what the person said and what they didn't say, because sometimes conversations can go on for a while. And one in particular, I was meeting with a person. I got on a plane in January and flew to the middle part of the country where it was cold and snowy. I think about 20-something below. It was snowing heavily. It was awful weather. And from the west coast where I was coming, it was relatively awful. And sitting down in front of someone I'd never met, and someone else from that branch was on the team, and they agreed to take notes, so they sat quietly. And I sat down. I basically said, "Hi, my name is Mark. It's good to meet you. It's nice to be here and meet you, face to face, have a conversation with you." I'd barely gotten that out of my mouth, and he just started to talk. And he let loose for about an hour and a bit. And it was great feedback. It was honest. It was candid. That's exactly what I was looking for. Even though, it might hurt sometimes to hear honest, candid feedback, you need it. Without it, you can't make good decisions. So, that was just so valuable. Again, being able to have a face-to-face conversation is really important. Doing it over the phone, I would not recommend. I always recommend having a note taker there sitting beside you off in the corner. They, of course, know the questions you're going to ask. Typically what I'll do is I'll say, look, let's put them into Excel. Every statement the person being interviewed makes, put it in a new cell, put it in a new line, because what we're going to do is we're actually going to print those onto labels. We're going to put those labels onto yellow Post-it notes, and we're going to create something called an affinity diagram, which we'll talk about shortly, as opposed to handwriting it, because it's hard to read and stuff. It's easier my way. So that's what I've typically done, and it's worked pretty well. So any questions on that? Hopefully I didn't ramble on too long. Any questions about the interview technique I suggested? No? Okay. So some of the advantages can tackle complex questions and cover a wide range of information, allows use of visual aids. Good choice when the individuals don't respond willingly and or accurately by phone or email. Again, if you're sitting across from someone and you're having a conversation, you're more likely to get an honest answer. It can be time consuming. In my case, I had to get on a plane and fly somewhere, but there was enough at stake that it was important, and I was able to do other work while I was there as well. Requires a trained and experienced interviewer. You need to practice as well. And so if you go in and, it's your first interview, let's say, you've done some practicing beforehand, you know what you're going to ask, you know how you're going to ask it, you've anticipated some follow-up questions, and so on. So you've prepared yourself. That preparation is so important when you're new to using the technique. As you become more adept at using it, it becomes, it's still always important to prepare, but it becomes maybe less time-consuming. You can become better at it. Maybe that's a better way to say it. You're better able to anticipate some questions, for example. So here's a table that shows the importance. Actually, let me just look at the time. How are we doing for time? I've been talking for a while. It always seems like when I'm talking, it goes by more quickly maybe than if I'm listening. I've got 12:22. I think this is probably a good place to take a short break. So unless anybody is opposed, why don't we break for 10 minutes? I've got 22 after the hour. We'll be back at 32 after the hour. Anybody opposed? I trust everybody had a good break. Now, where we left off just before, good to hear. Where we left off just before we went for the break, we were talking about capturing customer feedback, either internal customer or external customer. Now in this instance, we've created a table. So what we've done is we've gone out and we've collected all of this information. We've also assigned some values to it, both in terms of weighting and as well as a score presumably of 0 to 10 for each of the different areas, both telephone survey, web survey, and interview. So the factors or the criteria that we were looking at or found through the survey feedback were things like respondents' availability, lead data, cost involved, time consumption, availability of time from customer for the survey response rate. So these are the things that we're using to evaluate SORI for our decision on what type of analysis we're going to do. So we've gone out and we've weighted. Some of these things are more important to others, as you can see by the weightage. So that's why we want to incorporate that. And then, of course, we've looked at each of those individual elements for the different telephone surveys. And now we're going to go out and we're actually going to decide what method of survey, I should say, we're going to use and do that based on this analysis. Come on. There. Now, pros and cons for gathering information from customer complaints. Advantages, availability of specific feedback directly from the customer, of course, an easy option to respond appropriately to every customer. Disadvantages, things like feedback in this method doesn't provide an adequate sample size or may lead to process changes based on one or two inputs from the customer. So that might be a concern for us. And again, it's important to understand the sample size because that's one element of our, how robust is our approach. And if we have an insufficient sample size, then we might have a large margin of error. So you've probably heard of surveys that were accurate 95% of the time or 19 times out of 20 plus or minus some number of points. Well, if we do a survey and the sample size is inadequate, then we might have a large margin of error and we might make a mistake. We might, you've probably seen in cases of some elections where the prediction is for one candidate and they lose. And it's because there's a margin of error. Maybe they, again, it's 19 times out of 20 plus or minus. Maybe it was that one time out of 20, or maybe it fell outside of the margin of error. Product complaints and expedited service requests can act as inputs for the company for improving the process. So here we've got a product complaint. Rises when customer is dissatisfied. Product is not meeting customer specifications. Product has to be improved. Customer need for products are not completely identified. And expedited service requests would be things like this arises when customer is in a hurry. Service timelines are not meeting customer requirements. Service has to be improved, or customer timings need to be recalculated. As we put those factors in here, we've weighted them as you can see. We've got product complaint, we've got expedited request, and we've been able to score appropriately. Now, the data collection tools we're selecting are going to be determined and based on the type of data we're collecting. And so some of the key elements that make the tools effective are as follows. As the slide shows, data, by the way, is plural, not singular, so data are directly collected from the primary source, reducing the scope for miscommunication or loss of information. Data are highly reliable as they're collected exclusively for the stated purpose. Data are captured after understanding the organizational purpose, making them relevant. Data are collected instantaneously when there's a requirement, making it up to date and valid. Customer requirements are accurately defined within the data. And of course, any unintended bias. So here we've got a customer feedback sheet before the review. We've taken a look at, we've got the name, the gender, the occupation. We're sales executive supportive. It was a yes or no kind of attribute. It's either or. Binary. Was the product delivered on a sure time? Again, yes or no. Please rate overall experience between 1 and 10, 1 lowest, 10 highest. So that was before. Teams got through, they reviewed this, and they've changed some stuff. So, the name and gender is still there. The occupation, not only is instead of student professional, now they've got others please specify, so they've elaborated on that. because not everybody might categorize himself as being either a student or professional. And I've seen surveys that I was taking recently, in fact, where I didn't fit into one of the categories. And so do you skip the question? And some surveys, they don't let you skip a question if you want to submit it. And so you're forced to put in a wrong answer or just drop out of the survey altogether. That's obviously problematic. They didn't take the time to review it, I guess. In this case, they have, and they've made changes. Much better now. Rate sales executive on the below areas, 10 high, 1 low. I might add, in fact, I might use a 0 to 10 instead, where 0 represents not at all polite and 10 represents extremely polite. So I might clarify this even a little further. Just from the surveys I've seen, the more clarity you can provide, the more likely it is that you'll avoid people not understanding or misunderstanding what the question's asking. I've seen people on a 1 to 10 scale give a 1 thinking you guys are number 1. Doesn't happen often, but it does happen. And if you've got somebody that is not in favor of the survey in the first place, when they find out about this, they use that as a rallying cry. So avoid the problem altogether. I'd like a 0 to 10 instead of 1 to 10. And again, I would provide clarification so it's crystal clear on how to complete it. Just avoids the problem. So we've got, but again, a much better feedback review sheet than before. We've got some sales executives on specific criteria that we've deemed to be the important criteria. Politeness, ability to just understand and identify problem, quick reply to queries overall. Was the product delivered on assured time, yes or no? Please rate overall experience between 1 and 10, 1 lowest, 10 highest, so that's nicely done. And even with the product being delivered on assured time, yes or no, if you say no, was it 1 day, was it 10 days, was it 1 week, 1 month? You might even clarify that further. Again, maybe I'm erring on the side of too much caution, but you get the idea. So the VOC, or the voice of the customer, you want to organize, analyze, and profile the customer requirements. You're going out and capturing your customer stakeholders, and understanding what's important to them by asking them thoughtful, well-worded questions so that you can appropriately capture those things from them. You're not asking questions about what you would you think that they should want. You're trying to find out what they want. Following is an example for a customer requirement while purchasing an air conditioner. So who's the customer? It happens to be a household member. So it doesn't, maybe it would be a commercial air conditioning company. Maybe it's an HVAC company, for example. But in this case, it's a household member. And just as we know it's a household member, that would, of course, maybe exclude those people that weren't. So maybe if it was a commercial customer, this would not be appropriate. So by defining who the customer is, clearly like it is here in this example, that will be helpful and help avoid making some erroneous assumptions. So what the customer said, AC should be silent, AC should be efficient, AC should be economic. What is the need? Sound sleep, good cooling, affordability. When is it felt? At night, not appropriate or not applicable, I should say. Where's the need felt? Why is the need felt? How is the situation handled now? So all of this information has been captured based on the customer feedback. Now, we'll go through this in a couple of slides, and I alluded to an affinity diagram where when you did those interviews and your scribe had collected all of the customer verbatim into an Excel sheet, and each statement was put in its own cell or its own line, and that way you could print them off on labels and put them in yellow sticky Post-it notes, put them on a wall, for example, with your team. You go through, you organize it according to common themes or common issues. That's going to lead you to some of these statements in here. So you might have customers worded, AC should be silent. They might not all say it in those words. They might articulate it in different ways, but at the end of it, you've got some large number of customers saying that the AC should be silent. Some saying it should be efficient, some saying it should be economic, and so on. That's where you've gotten that information from. You probably wouldn't have that level of detail unless you asked the right questions. And so you might spend time and money and resources delivering things that maybe weren't as important to your customer and then you don't understand, why it isn't delivering the value that you had thought it would. So customer requirements are the data collected from customers that give information on what they need or want from a process. Sometimes they don't know what they need, they only know what they want. And so this process also gives you better insight into what they need. I think Henry Ford once said if he had asked his customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, and they really needed a car. Customer requirements are often high-level, vague, non-specific. When translated into the critical process requirements that are specific and measurable, they're called critical to quality factors. So that's where you get, customers give these high-level, vague statements. They can be, through the use of some of these tools that we'll be talking about, they can be converted into very specific, measurable requirements, critical to quality factors. And that's where you can then deliver something in a much more surgical way that customers truly do value. That's how we get things like the iPod, for example. A fully developed critical to quality is 4 major elements: the output characteristic, the Y metric, the target, and the spec or tolerance limits. So critical quality factors are quality parameters that are set by the organization relating to the customer's needs. The CTQ, or critical to quality tree, is a diagram-based tool that helps develop and deliver quality products and services. So here we've got identifying the needs. So we identify the critical needs that the product is to meet. We define the product requirements in broad terms. We ask the customers directly or brainstorm on their needs with people in direct contact with customers. I think maybe what I might do is, I might have that brainstorming session first and then take that information to my customers and talk to them to validate it. Or maybe you could even have a focus group instead, collect that information, and then do a survey to validate it. So you can use different approaches to get to the same place. What makes sense for your particular circumstance? That's really probably the defining feature there. You'll identify the quality drivers, so identifying the specific quality drivers that need to be in place to meet the needs. You'll identify all the drivers that are important to the customers, understand the factors that are important to them. And then you'll identify the performance requirements. So the minimum performance requirements satisfy the requirements for each quality driver to provide a quality product. And you'll want to remember the things that may affect your ability to deliver these as well. Now the QFD, or Quality Function Deployment Tool, I mentioned earlier on, it's called the House of Quality because of how it looks when it's all created. And you'll see that in a moment. That's a process to understand the customer needs and translate them into a set of design and manufacturing requirements while motivating businesses to focus on its customers. And when I say manufacturing, I want you to think about that in a really broad, general sense. I don't just mean, let's say, on a factory floor where they manufacture widgets or some type of an industrial setting. Think about it in terms of producing something as well. That could be a service. Maybe we manufacture a hamburger at a McDonald's restaurant. Maybe we manufacture an experience that a customer might have at a movie theater or something like that. So I want you to think about manufacturing in a very general sense. It helps companies design and build more competitive products in less time and lesser cost. Maybe a city that was looking at offering improved service levels without raising taxes or even lowering taxes and still having improved services, that'd get people reelected. So it gives you a distinct competitive advantage when you can design and build things like this. It also helps you understand all of your different areas. So customer requirements, it's going to help you understand the organization's strengths and weaknesses. It's going to help you understand areas where most of the work is done and where the focus should be. Now we go about this in 4 phases. or at least in the deployment of the QFD involves 4 phases. The output is of a phase becomes an input of the next phase. So you can see at the very beginning, during the product planning, we've got customer requirements going into that. The output would be the technical requirements. The technical requirements then become the input for the next step, which is the product design. The product design produces the key part characteristics as an output, which become the input for the process planning phase. The output of the process planning phase would be the key process operations, which becomes the input for the process control, and then your output is establishing process control plans, maintenance plans, training plans to control operations. So as I said before, it looks almost like a house. So this is, in a kind of a very general sense, what your QFD would look like, or your house of quality. And you can see, even the little areas there, 1, customer requirements, that's called the customer requirements room. The planning matrix, room. The technical requirements, room, and so on. And then you've got the roof up on top. Looks like a house, and that's why it's called a house of quality. Also sometimes just called either quality function deployment or QFD for short. So if I'm referring, I'll try to be consistent, but admittedly I'll probably fail at that. So if I sometimes call it a QFD, I'm talking about the same thing as when I refer to it as a house of quality or HOQ. Same stuff. So the first part of the house of quality matrix would be the customer requirements. You can see highlighted in blue customer requirements. It's a documented version of the customer requirements for a product. Inputs are collected through direct conversations with the customers. List of customer inputs should be structured before they enter the house of quality. The organization can also collect customer requirements by brainstorming with people who work with the customers directly. So somehow we've gone out and we've collected all of this information, whether it was through surveys or interviews or focus groups or just talking to your sales and marketing folks or frontline folks about what customers say to them directly, and you've done some brainstorming. So however, whatever methods that you've used, 1 or multiple of those, you've been able to organize it and put it into your customer requirements here. So that's the first step. And it might look something like this. So customer requirements prioritization measures for each customer requirement are gathered from the questionnaire, and the AHP stands for Analytical Hierarchy Process. High priority requirements are rated 1, low priority requirements are rated 0, so it's kind of a binary 0 or 1. For every requirement, calculate the sum of customers who voted it as a high priority, calculate the percentage of these customers. I've also seen people use different scales in this. This is certainly very common, 0 and 1, but I've seen other people use different scales, 1 to 5, like a Likert scale, for example. So we've got things like lasts a long time, inexpensive, protects good, doesn't rust. These are pretty high level. I mean, what does last a long time mean? I don't know. It kind of sounds like when we were talking about intangibles before. Things seem to be better. People seem to be happier. I feel better about this than I did before. I mean, it sounds really good, and it's a nice story to tell, and everybody will nod their head and smile. But I don't know what that means. Lasts a long time. Inexpensive. Again, sounds good, but I don't know what that means. So if somebody says, well, what does inexpensive mean? If I'm challenged, I can't answer them intelligently about it, because at this level, I don't yet know. We've gone through this, and we've had customers prioritize these things, and as you can see, we've come up with those values. We move over to the planning matrix room, second stage here. We're providing a measure of customer satisfaction with the existing products. It's used to rate the industry competitors on each of the customer requirements, or the what's important. It helps the organization to get an overview of their performance when compared with industry competitors. A 5-scale rating is used, so like a Likert scale, 1 to 5. And so this is a good opportunity where we're comparing things. Here's where we are today. Here's where our competitors, maybe best in class, are today. How do we compare against them? Third part of the house of quality is would be the technical requirements room, also known as engineering characteristics or voice of the company. This section describes products in terms of the company. So the House of Quality, or the QFD, Quality Function Deployment team, identifies all the measurable characteristics of the product which are related to customer requirements. Helps identify the minimum performance requirements the organization must satisfy for each of those customer requirements. Organizational factors that affect the ability to deliver the desired high-quality product need to be listed. Fourth phase, or fourth part of the House of Quality, would be the interrelationships matrix. So this is the main body of the House of Quality matrix. To translate customer requirements into technical characteristics of the product. QFD team identifies the significance of these interrelationships. The level of interrelationships is weighted on a scale, and each level is assigned a score that is agreed by the QFD team or the project team. It's your Six Sigma team, really, and one of the tools they're using is a QFD, same thing. You may have brought in some other people to participate in this one exercise if that makes sense for your team and your project. And if that's the case, maybe you've got some different team members that are also participating, but that would be a little unusual. And then we've got the roof. That's the fifth part of the House of Quality. Speaks about the impact of the hows on the whats. Identifies where the technical requirements of the product support or obstruct each other. We talked about earlier on today a constraining why, where we have an improvement in one thing but at the expense of another. You know, we said, gosh, our customers are complaining too much through the survey or through feedback or the interviews that we don't seem to have the right stock when they come into our store. We always seem to be out of stuff. And so what we've done is we've invested heavily in inventory, and we're pretty excited about that. And we've stocked our shelves full of additional merchandise. And we've got a warehouse that's filled with stuff in the back as well. The problem, of course, is that's a considerable investment we've just made. We've piled a lot of money into the inventory. Maybe that wasn't the right way to do things. So if we've got other constraints or other issues, maybe we also look at inventory turns. What's important is to bring the right stuff. So when customers need it, they can get it quickly or on the spot. But we understand their needs well enough that we don't stock the stuff they don't really want. So we've balanced that. So this is something that we look at as well. We want to make sure that the technical requirements of the product are, they either support, we want to understand if they support or obstruct each other, one or the other. Maybe they're neutral, maybe they don't have an impact, but this is where we'll understand that. So the QFD team considers the pairing of the technical requirements to form a matrix. If improving one requirement leads to deterioration, trade-offs exist, and we put in a minus symbol. So if there's some type of interaction which leads to a deterioration, and as a result, we'll put in a minus. If improving one requirement leads to the improvement of the technical requirement, we'll put in a plus symbol. And if it's neutral, there's no impact or no interaction, we'll just leave it blank. And then the targets. And this is where we summarize the conclusions drawn from the data from the entire matrix and team discussions. This is where we'll have technical priorities. So each interrelationship weighting is multiplied by the overall weighting from the planning matrix. The competitive benchmarks that show the relative technical position of the existing product and identify the target levels of performance to be achieved in a new product. And as the final output of the House of Quality, or the QFD matrix, it's a set of engineering target values to be met by the new available. I've got one here. Show you. Can you all see my screen? There's a browser here with some colored shapes.
Yes, I can see it.
Good. Okay, good news. The URL for that, www.webducate, webducate.net/QFD/QFD and HTML. This is a very good illustration that you can use for the QFD. And so, for example, if I put my cursor over customer requirements, and I click that on, it's up, and it goes through customer requirements. I can click the next, and it goes through, and it talks about the customer requirements. We talked about, you've gone out and you've collected a bunch of information from customers, and you've got all those individual statements, moving it into an affinity diagram. And so you can see how they're together here. So we've got in this particular example here, we've got usability, we've got performance, and then there's a lone wolf over here, attractive. And so on. So it's again a very good way to walk through the QFD or Hrs of Quality tool. I'll end this piece, but you can you go to the second piece. It walks through this as well. Gives a very nice detailed explanation. Talks to you how you can complete this as well. I'll go directly up here. Shows you the roof. Talks you through there. So I wanted to share this with you because it's just like the ASQ site and the Six Sigma site and the Six Sigma tutorial site, this is another very good site that I've come across that I think is useful for somebody that's going to use a QFD, particularly if you've got some type of a project where you need to go out and do some type of a voice of the customer analysis, either internal or external customers, where you've got a process that, that's kind of the goal. You want to improve customers' experience in some respect, internally or externally, and you may not have existing metrics. So in some of those customer requirements where they're vague and they're not very specific, you can convert them through this approach or through this tool to become much more specific. So we've got manufacturing specs that say, I like my coffee to be a little bit sweet but not too sweet, and it's got to be hot but not so hot that it burns me, and it's got to be served quickly. Well, they're all soft statements, and I don't really know how to define those very specifically, which makes it hard for your frontline people to say, well, what do I do with that information? I don't know. I mean, I understand they want it, that, kind of like Goldilocks just right, but I don't know what just right is. Well, now we can get very specific and say the temperature of that coffee should be between this and this. This amount of sugar to be used should be this much. It should be served within this time frame. You can get much more specific that way so that you can provide the information and the resources to set your people up to be successful and deliver an experience or a product or a service that your customers will say, gosh, they really understand what's important to me and they know me. I can always count on Mark's coffee service to take care of me. Mark really seems to know me well. I like Mark. I'm going to tell my friends about him, and I'd be willing to pay more just because he's such a good guy and does such a good job for me. That's the kind of relationship we want. We need to be much more surgical and scientific in our approach and move from those intangible soft statements to much more specific requirements. There's also in your materials, let me just go into here. The toolkit, lesson and define, Hrs of Quality, there it is. So in your toolkit, in your materials, you've got a lot of different materials here that can help you with this work. So the SIPOC map I showed you, before suppliers, the input process, you don't have to create that from scratch. There's a template there for you, which is very well done, very nice, that you can use to create a SIPOC map for your particular process. And so here we have some examples, and this is pre-completed with some information in here that you could look through. So in this case, relationship matrix, they've used scaling of 9 strong, 3 moderate, 1 weak. They're looking at service levels, IVR, integrated voice response, call work, productivity, and calls per hour, cost per exposure. You can complete it this way for you. Again, it looks kind of like a house. If you haven't already, to look through your toolkit and some of the materials that are there. I can do that at the end of the class as well, time permitting, and go through that. But there's a lot of material, so we'll play that one by ear. But certainly on your own time, if you're interested, I would recommend that you do that. Again, there's no point in recreating something when there's a template or a tool that is very nicely done and it's available there for you. So all of the tools that will be used, materials that we'll cover, there are templates there for you as well. Are there any questions at this point about either the VOC stuff that we've just covered or any of the materials we've covered so far today? No questions? Okay. Okay, well, certainly if any come up, please feel free to ask them. And I don't want to bug you by continuing to ask, but I'd rather address and answer any questions if I can than leave anybody that is thinking and afraid to ask. So as we're in the define phase, we're going to go through and talk about some of the project management basics, because this is really all about managing a project. We've got some element of the organization or business that we need to improve. It's keeping people up at night. It's probably having some type of a significant impact on financial success of the organization. It's probably filtering down through the organization by affecting stakeholders in different ways. Certainly, share price if it's a public company, so your stockholders, your shareholders might not be excited. Might put pressure on the CEO or some of the senior leadership. Do they get to keep their job? Are they going to be replaced? Might make for some uncomfortable board meetings. If you're one of those investors and you've got your retirement savings in, it's probably of concern to you. As an employee of the organization, you probably would be concerned as well, because of that. But even if it isn't a public company and you're not a stockholder, you're another stakeholder, let's say you're an employee, that gets filtered down because maybe the organization has less money to give people raises or bonuses. Maybe they aren't replacing people, they're allowing attrition to reduce the workforce and just giving more people more work to do, doing more with less, I think I hear people say from time to time, which makes it stressful for people. You're having to work longer hours, maybe you've got taking more time off because you get sick more frequently since you run down, you're more stressed out at home and at work. So it filters down to the organization and affects people in a variety of different ways. And so we're working on stuff that is important for a number of different reasons. And specify the observed gap in performance by setting the current baseline and measuring the gap against customer needs. It should also be quantifiable with metrics. It should never, ever contain solutions or causes for the problem. If you know the solution, why haven't you put it in place? If you know the causes for the problem, why haven't you addressed them already? If that's the case, if you know the cause and or you know the solution, then you don't really need a project to figure it all out. So I would say, just go do it. Maybe do some planning to make sure you understand, if you've got a contingency plan in place in case things don't turn out well. But again, it's not a full-blown project. We're working on stuff we don't know the answer to. It's probably something that's been plaguing the business for a long time. It's probably something we've tried throwing stuff at in the past and it hasn't really worked well enough. It's probably causing grief to different elements of the business. And by going through a more robust, more methodical way to get to the bottom of it, using not only the methodology that the project leader will employ, but relying on the subject matter experts, we're in a much better position to solve it once and for all. We want to be clear and concise in our problem statements. So we want to be able to state we want to improve this process from where we are today, or at least where we believe we are today, to some improved state, and maybe we've got some target in mind. Now, those two numbers are subject to change because our baseline is based on what we think the measure is today. We haven't actually validated our measurement system yet. And sometimes I've seen people use a metric for the performance of a process, and when they try to validate that measurement system, they find out that it's not correct. You can imagine that if you've got a watch that's running slow and you're recording time, it's probably not going to give you an accurate reading of time. If I'm using a scale to weigh something, is it appropriate for its need? If I'm measuring cement, measuring in ounces is probably fine, but if I'm measuring gold dust, measuring to ounces probably isn't. I need to be much more, have much more resolution than that. I remember working on a project one time where we looked at spend on brokerage as we would import stuff from other countries, and it had to clear through customs, and we had a broker fill out the paperwork, prepare the paperwork. The problem was that there were a number of different brokers we were using, and that created a number of different problems. And so one of my first conversations was, well, as a team we decided, gosh, we're spending a huge amount of money on brokerage. We could hire a couple of people, have a traffic department for about half the price what we're spending today. So somebody said, well, I'll make a call to the headhunter that we use for these types of professional services. Not to place the order, we agreed quite yet, but at least to put them on the lookout, and if anything came across their desk, at least they'd be aware that we were thinking about looking. So we started the ball rolling in that way. Not very far, but we started it. I called the CFO and said, what do we spend on brokerage? And she told me a number, and it matched with what our records reported. So we said, well, gosh, that's a lot of money. Let's go through our validation and make sure that that's correct. We did did an audit of that particular GL, and we found out now there was some other stuff. Freight was going in there, some taxes were going in there. There was other stuff going in, and we actually spent about half of what we thought. So moral of that story is that just because you start with your objective statement, or at least you think it's objective, doesn't mean it's written in stone. You might think you need to improve from 80 to 90%, without harming that performance of that element of the process. You put that in there as well, but those numbers are subject to change as you gain a better understanding of the process. As you go through it and you do your MSA or your measurement systems analysis, you validate or find the correct numbers, so they could change. But it's important at least to start with where we think we are today. That's your current baseline. We think we need to get to there, and the gap or the difference is what we need to close. I spend a lot of time on that piece because it's so important, and it's one of those things that sometimes people gloss over and they go through a little too quickly, and it can come back to haunt them. So just make sure that you appreciate that. You do have that statement. It is measurable. If it's an appropriate approach to have a constraining why, which it often is, that you include that, but you recognize those numbers all need to be validated. You might also use something called an is or is not template. Again, there's one in your toolkit. It's a very good tool that's going to help you define the problem and gather information, what it is and what it's not. In the analysis phase, if cause cannot be described, the is and is not data, then it's not likely the main cause. So we've got a problem here of a paper leak in cups. So what we know is this, the what, where, when, to what extent. We know that there are slow leaks in 12-ounce cups. We know that there are not visible gaps in the seams. We know that there are not styrofoam cups or plastic cups or 16-ounce or 20-ounce paper cups. So that's what we know is, and that's what we know is not. Where? Bottom of the cup at the joint of vertical seam with bottom, less than 5 millimeters from the bottom. We know it's not 6 millimeters above the bottom, anywhere else along the bottom away from the vertical seam. We know when, the second shift production 2 weeks ago and 1 year ago. We know when it's not, one shift production or first shift production between 11 months and 3 weeks ago. And to what extent, 10% of production overall, 20 to 30% on the second shift, drip rate of 30 per minutes, I should say. And we know it's not same extent in both shifts all the time, barely noticeable, 1 per minute or immediately obvious, and so on. So it's important for that problem statement to define what it is and what it's not, because we can be far more precise about what we're looking at and not invest time and energy and resources in going after stuff that it's not. If we can get to what it is more quickly, then we're going to be able to get to the bottom of the problem more quickly as well, of course. Stands to reason. Again, it seems like a really obvious approach. It's not one I've seen used very often, surprisingly, but it's very powerful and it's easy. I mean, this, it doesn't take you and your team very long to learn how to use the tool. The hard part isn't you understanding how to use the tool. It's going out and making sure that you understand what is and what is not, so you can invest your time in the right work. You might have also heard of SMART goals or SMARTs, in this case, goals, criteria. So you want to be specific. The project deliverable should be specific. Going in and asking for time to, 20% of your time to work on a project. By the way, you need these 6 other people to work on your project team with you, and they're all, important individuals to the organization. You need their couple hours a week from each of them. Maybe you need to, go visit another location, and you need to do some other stuff. Maybe from your IT, they've got to invest some time and energy. Asking for all of that because something doesn't feel right isn't going to get you probably very far. Being able to be specific and measurable and have specific project deliverables, that's going to be a much more powerful statement when you request that investment. Measurable objectives should be quantifiable. Again, it feels good, it seems better. I don't know what that means. Sounds really good and it makes you smile, but I'm not sure I'd want to invest my money to have someone say at the end of the day, yeah, things seem to be better. Should be attainable. Project objectives should be achievable and practical. I want to get to 100%, might not be realistic, it might not be achievable, and so if I set that as my target, my bogey, I might disappoint. You never want to overpromise and underdeliver, not that you want to sandbag, but it has to be realistic, it has to be attainable. I know that for customer satisfaction, I'm probably not going to get 100%, but I might be able to make an improvement of 10 or 20%. Relevant project objectives should be relevant to the problem, should be time-based. The project objectives must specify time frame from which they should be delivered. Asking for an open-ended period of time to work on something probably isn't going to get you too far. You need to be able to say, I think we can get this done within this time frame. And maybe it's so important that it's all hands on deck. I remember talking to someone that said that might take 3, 4, 5 months for a typical project. And the stretch. The project objectives must not be easily achievable. Again, we don't want to sandbag. I want to improve customer satisfaction from 50% to 55%. You probably do that in your sleep almost. So you want to have something that's achievable, but it's also got to be something that's a bit of a stretch. You have to work hard. project documentation. It's going to include the documents that provide the details about the project as well as help to gain a better understanding of the project. It's going to help prevent and resolve conflicts among stakeholders down the road maybe. If their understanding changes, you can refer back to these documents. And share plans and status for the project. So this is the information that's going to help, and when we talk about it being documents or paperwork, it can be electronic, probably more likely to be electronic. It's going to have that charter, that outline of what you're working on with your objective statement, who's involved, and where you think you are today, your baseline, where you think you'll be able to get at the end of the project, what that improvement would mean to the organization, both the tangible and intangible benefits that can be derived from the project, all that kind of stuff. So it's crystal clear to anybody looking at this today, tomorrow, next month, what the project is all about. And if anybody comes back to the project leader and says, well, gosh, what about this? You can say, you know, was it part of the scope or was it not? If it's out of scope, it's out of scope. Helps the team achieve a common understanding of the requirements and status of the project. Maybe more importantly than the team, it helps the organization come to a common understanding of the requirements and the status of the project. Again, you might have someone say, well, what about this? I thought you were going to work on that as well. I'm not seeing an improvement. And you can say, well, gosh, that wasn't part of the scope of this project, and here was the rationale why. And it's all back in that original project charter, that documentation. It removes personal biases. There's a documented story of discussions and decisions made for the project. It's aligning all of the details of the project at the outset so that you're all on the same page. And then you'll update it, of course, as you progress through it. So you'll have the project charter, project plan, the key milestones report. So you might have some type of a management review group or an MRG that you'll meet with the project leader, maybe even the team will accompany them, but more likely it'll be the project leader that meets with the sponsor and some other executives to provide a periodic update. Maybe as you go from the define phase to the measure phase to the analyze phase and so on, to report any updates. Here's where we were, here's what we've accomplished, here's where we're headed. By the way, in addition to any questions, here's what we need from you, if you do. So these are some examples of the different pieces of documentation that probably will accompany a report. Now, in addition to, it might sound like there's some bureaucracy, and I guess to some extent there is, but it's absolutely critical. It's not done just to create paperwork or electronic or literally paper information about the report. It's also done in addition to keeping everyone aligned and on the same page and updated on a need-to-know basis, that if the project was about X and you're in this location or this department or this branch or this wherever, and the same issue is a challenge somewhere else, rather than having to reinvent the wheel and start a project from scratch somewhere else, if you've got high employee turnover or low productivity or excessive costs or whatever your challenge happened to be someplace else, if you've got a repository of projects and this information is kept there, somebody can go in and query this database, let's say, or this repository, and say, have there been any other products that have addressed these issues? Here are the words or phrases that you put in, and you can say, gosh, there was another project maybe in Indianapolis that was done, and I'm in Ohio somewhere, or I'm someplace else, Texas, for that maybe as an example. Maybe what I can do is I can review their paperwork, I can review the project and see what they've done. Maybe I can even get the project leader or sponsor on the phone and have a conversation with that individual or those individuals, and launch the project that way. That way, instead of taking 3, 4, 5 months, maybe I can cut the time frame down by some amount of time. So there are a couple of big advantages to making sure you've got project documentation for your work. Now, I mentioned the project charter, and it's a written document. Again, it might be paper, it might be electronic, more likely to be electronic. It's a document that defines the team's mission, scope of operations, objectives, the time frame, consequences for the project, all of those details. It's also something that enables formal approval from the senior management to start the project. So it probably includes some measurable objective to be achieved from the project. You want to improve from here to there. Organizational operation boundaries of the project, and top management support and commitment. So what often happens is that the belt will write the problem statement and project charter in combination or in collaboration with the sponsor for the project. The project charter is reviewed by, and it depends on the organization. In some cases it might be a black belt. In some cases it might be a master black belt. I worked with an organization for a number of years where it went through, once the belt and the sponsor agreed to the charter, you hit submit for approval to launch the project, and it went to the sponsor course first to make sure that they were on board. It affirmed their support for the project. It went to a master black belt. It went to a champion, and I think it went to someone else. So it went through several layers. Each individual would review the information, and they would either approve it or deny it. If they denied it, they would state the reasons. So, for example, it might be that the master black belt or the champion would notice some technical issue and say, well, gosh, you said you're going to improve something, but you didn't put a number in there. Or maybe you didn't list this information, or that information is missing, but they might have some objection to it, and they would guide and coach the person to correct it. But in any event, it's going through some type of an approval cycle to make sure that it gets approved by the appropriate stakeholders and that the project moves forward with the best opportunity for success. So you write it, get it reviewed, and then it gets approved. And the approval cycle will just depend on the organization and whatever parameters they put in place. So some of the major sections of a project charter are as follows. There's an example in your toolkit. I've seen, there's certainly a number of them online. Some organizations will have, if they've already got an existing Six Sigma program or Lean Six Sigma program, they may have some type of an electronic version that they use. So there's no hard and fast rule that says this is the only one you shall use. Whatever makes sense for your business. But this is an excellent one, and most of them have the same basic information. They might just be, presented a little differently, and in terms of shapes and pictures and colors and graphics, but most of them have pretty much the same information in them. So there's not a lot of variation. But again, there's no standard way that says it must be done this way. So it'll have things like the project's name and description, the business need or a problem statement, the project manager's name, the belt, project purpose or justification, including an ROI. Now, I would recommend, if you don't have this already, to put both the tangible or measurable benefits. It's going to, if we get from increasing something or decreasing something, if we get from here to there, it's worth this much money. The marginal value for each, let's say 1% improvement in this process means that much money to the organization. There are also some other, other benefits that we anticipate seeing. We're not sure how to measure them today, or maybe we won't be able to measure them, but here's some things that we're going to be looking at. Maybe finding a measure for customer or employee satisfaction is out of scope, and so you're going to probably it would be the sponsor that would help facilitate this, would help understand stakeholder requirements. I wouldn't anticipate a belt having to go figure out what shareholders want or what external customers want. There'd probably be a more appropriate way to stick handle through that. The sponsor would be able to provide some guidance. There should be some broad timelines. We expect it to be completed in 4 months or 6 months or whatever period of time as we see it today. That's obviously subject to change as you get a more thorough understanding of the process and what you're working with. It might take longer, it might take less time. Just depends on what you find. But your best guess at this point is, here's how much time. By the way, as we go through the define, measure, analyze, and improve and control phases, we anticipate that the project will, each major deliverable will take place, maybe it's 30 days per phase. And we anticipate in 150 days to be completed with this project. So 30 days through the define, the measure, and so on. Some may go faster, some may go slower. Constraints and assumptions, any that you're aware of at this point. They can be subject to change for obvious reasons, but at least at this point, based on your current understanding at the beginning of the project, here are some assumptions or constraints that you've got in place. Maybe a summary budget. We anticipate having to spend some money for these reasons. So this is the kind of stuff that your project charter should outline. And even if it isn't a Six Sigma project, it's just a project in your business for any other purpose, I would say that this is not a bad format to use. A lot of this information is probably pretty helpful to you and provides a little bit more, robust approach, I think, to managing a project, even if it was a just do it. Your project plan is the final approved document which is used to manage and control the various processes within a project and helps ensure the seamless project execution, or at least it increases the likelihood of a seamless project execution. So the project manager, the belt, uses the project charter as an input to create a detailed project plan. Some of the major sections of the project charter we've looked at, and they would include, you've got the project management approach and scope statement, the work breakdown structure, the cost estimates and schedule, performance baseline, major milestones, key or required staff, your team members, both the full-time team members or the ones that are expected to attend every team meeting, I should say, as well as maybe some extended team members. You might know going in that, hey, at some point in this project, based on what we know today and what we are expecting, at least, that we're going to need some IT resources. Maybe we know that when we do that measurement systems analysis, or the MSA for short, that we're going to need some help with the data collection, extracting it from our system. We don't really have an expert in place that understands SQL or Access or whatever you happen to be using to extract the data. Maybe there isn't a report that you can download. Or maybe you need someone from finance to give you access to some of the source documents or the ledger accounts, or maybe they'll do that with you or for you. But you'll bring them in for some point in the project for a specific purpose. That's all they need to be part of. You don't need your IT person in an operations or an HR project all the way along. It really has nothing to do with them in the example at least. But you need their help with one aspect of the project, so they'll be an extended team member. They'll parachute in for that point where their help and expertise is needed. They provide it, and then they get to go away. You don't need to make them attend team meetings that have nothing to do with them. Not a good use of their time. So key required staff, identify that on the front end. Open or pending decisions, key risks. Because it might be that you're about to implement a new ERP system, and when you need them, they're going to be completely bogged down with the implementation of that ERP, or maybe you're expecting sometime in April time frame when your finance person is maybe tied down doing the taxes to help you with some financial issues. It may not be a good idea, so you might, by identifying it at the front end, you avoid those issues or problems. Now the project scope, and this is one of those areas where I found most projects have challenges with, because what essentially happens is, given that the project scope refers to all the work involved in creating the products of the project and the processes used to create them, they're the boundaries that are being developed and reviewed to ensure that the project adds value to the customer. So this is the boundaries through, within which your project is focused. If you're working on improving the time to onboard new employees, then you're probably going to uncover other issues that are related to human resources, or maybe other issues that are related to some other aspect of your project. But they're not within the scope. And even though it's an opportunity that maybe is important to the business and could be improved with some time and effort, if you go after all of those opportunities, because they're outside of the scope, you get the scope creep. And suddenly you're going after that issue and this issue and another issue, and those issues lead to other issues. And it blows up on you. You've got far too much stuff that you're trying to keep a handle on, and your project ultimately implodes or explodes on you because of that. So you define your boundaries, and what you do, practically speaking, is this. You uncover an opportunity to improve the business, but it's outside of the scope of your project. You don't forget about it. You identify it as a potential future project, or maybe even as a just do it. You recognize because it's outside of the scope, you're not going to include it at this point in time, but it's documented, it's reported to the appropriate people or person. There's probably some conversation that takes place, and maybe during one of your milestone updates, you address the issue, you bring up the issue, and make people aware of it, but you don't include it in the project scope. So you define, verify, and control the project scope in the scope planning piece. You review the project charter as you scope definition. You divide the project into smaller milestones. So that might be, the define, measure, analyze phases. Scope verification, so you receive acceptance of the project scope. Scope control changes to project scope. If there is something that is found to be really important, and it's maybe whether it's related or not, somebody says, look, we need to include this because we didn't anticipate this being an issue, but it's so important that maybe this is almost as important as your project, or this element is, even though it's out of scope. It's not so massive that it's a project unto itself, and you've got the right people in place already. You know what? We're going to include this, and we're going to revise the scope and just adjust it a little bit. That can happen too. Your scope is going to be interpreted from the problem statement and the project charter using a variety of tools. Here are a couple of tools that you might be used to interpret that scope. Something called a Pareto chart. You might have heard of the 80-20 rule. A guy by the name of Alfredo Pareto did some studies going back, I think, the 18th or 19th century. I can't remember which now. It's been a while since I read his history. But in any event, what he did was he looked at land ownership, and he was really looking at wealth, which was at that time defined by land ownership. And he found that about 80% of the wealth, or 80% of the land, was held by about 20% of the population. And he created this idea, as he wrote about it, that wealth distribution followed this 80-20 rule. Well, Joseph Duran in the 1930s picked up on what Pareto had done, and he expanded on this to apply it more generally to most things out there. That most, 80% of most stuff comes from 20% of stuff. And created this chart, or this graph called the Pareto chart. It sounds better, Pareto chart, probably, than Duran chart. And because it originated from Alfredo Pareto's wealth studies, land distribution, that it just became known as the Pareto chart. That's kind of the history. It's a way to make sure that you're focused on the vital few rather than trivial many. So, as the slide shows, a Pareto chart assists to narrow the scope of the project by identifying the causes that have a major impact on the project. If we're looking at all the things that have an impact, it helps define the scope of your project. It starts here and it ends there. It doesn't include stuff that happens before the starting point. It doesn't include stuff that happens after the starting point or outside of that SIPOC map. So again, a couple of useful tools to help scope the project. Now these are tools that, although they're used in the define phase, are used throughout the course. Well, certainly the Pareto chart will be used again, typically in the measure and or the analyze phase. The SIPOC map quite often in the measure phase as you and your team are mapping out the project with all the details as well. Now, process maps, in this case, it's this process map. We're going to look at a micro-level flow chart that provides an in-depth detail of a process. It covers all the details at all the levels and provides a walkthrough of the current process experience. So you see here a SIPOC map where they've got step 1, step 2, step 3 through to step N. We've got the supplier on the front end or the top and the customer at the, in this case, in the illustration, at least the bottom end. And then you can look at each element and break it down further and further with more detail. It can be used as a blueprint while drawing a process map. So a level 1 process map provides in-depth information on the process, but the final process map dwells further into the details. Now I'm just going to come back to the slide for a second because there are a variety of different styles of process maps. There's the SIPOC map is just one example. You've probably heard of cross-functional process maps or flow charts. We talked a little bit before about value stream maps. There are a variety of different styles and types of process maps, and we'll go through them. But I want you to remember that the style that you choose should be based on that particular circumstance, and to some extent, admittedly, it'll be driven a little bit by your preference with each of the tools. So some people, for example, really love value stream maps, and they would, in any circumstance, find validation for using a value stream map as opposed to a SIPOC map or as opposed to a cross-functional process map or some other style. Conversely, there are probably people out there that would say, you know what, the value stream map is fine and dandy when you need one, but frankly, I find a SIPOC map to be just fine. It does everything I need it to do. So to some extent, it's based on preference. Use the one that makes sense for you in those circumstances. But there are a variety of different styles and types of process maps. It's really just a visual representation of your process and the different components or pieces of that process. And you're using it to understand all of the different elements. So from the start to the end of your process, it's defining that, all the pieces in between, what makes it up, and so on. And it's done not as a lone wolf activity ever, 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 but always with your team participation. You're subject matter experts. And it's a very, very good learning experience for everybody because it gives you that visual representation of what's going on today, not what you'd like to have going on today or what you think should be going on today, but no fooling. Let's not kid ourselves. This is really what's happening today. For better or for worse, as ugly as it might look, this is really what's happening. And you map that out. Now, you'll also want to have project metrics. They're the fundamental elements required for measuring a project's progress. They're developed in the define phase, but they're not finalized till the measure phase of the project. And what I mean by that is that at the beginning of your project, someone says, look, we believe this area of the business is costing us a lot of time and money and resources. It's keeping us up at night for these reasons. This is why it's important. So because of this, there is, in our opinion at least, justification to take on a project. We believe that this is the current performance of this process. We're here, and we believe that in order to be competitive, we need to be there. Or in order to reduce our costs to this level, we need to be there. But there's probably some parameter that's put in place for the belt, and maybe even the sponsor, if they're not the one driving it, that says, here's where we are today, and here's where we need to get to. That's done in the define phase. It's still somewhat of a best guess because you haven't validated your measurement system yet. You do that in the measure phase when you do your measurement systems analysis, your MSA, and that's when you actually go out and find the true reference. So if we're looking at a financial number, maybe that means going to the source documents in the GL rather than just taking the GL words for it. Auditors will come in and audit your financial statements if you're a public company, for example. They don't just take your word for it. If you say, here are your assets and here are your liabilities and this is the owner's equity, they're not just going to take your word for it. They're going to say, well, that sounds really good and it looks like you're profitable, but you know what? We need to verify it. When you say that your accounts receivable are this and your accounts payable are that they're true numbers. So they'll come in and they'll actually test the data to make sure that they are what you purport them to be. Well, we're doing a similar thing with the MSA. If we're looking at financial number and we're looking at reducing freight costs because we believe we're spending too much on freight, maybe because we don't have the right inventory in stock, and as a result of that, we've always got to expedite and fly stuff in or ship stuff in, then we'd go to the financial statements, look at our freight charges, and say, well, do we really spend that much on freight? Or if we're timing the amount of waste we've got in an equipment repair facility that I illustrated before when I talked about working on a project and we did that spaghetti diagram. We had people stopping what they were doing to go get stuff. Well, if we really believe that we're wasting some period of time each day, we've got lots of productivity, and instead of working for 8 hours, they only work for 7 hours, and the other 1 hour is wasted. Simplify the example. Then we'd actually go out and we'd measure stuff. Maybe we'd give them pedometers or some, maybe a Fitbit or something to measure how much time they're actually working in their space and how much time they're out walking about looking for stuff. So we'd actually measure. And that, again, is the MSA piece of the measure phase. So we've got our primary metrics. Supplies, internal processes, and customers are the source that provide the primary metrics for the product, or project, I should say. Some examples, these are obviously very high level. Quality, cycle time, cost, value, labor. We, in real life, would probably have a more definitive example of quality. Maybe it's some defects, and that might be in terms of returned goods. It might be in customer complaint, number of customer complaints. It might be in some type of a customer satisfaction score, and so on. Cycle time, again, cost, value, labor. Again, these are high level. In real life, for our project, we would probably have specific metrics we're using. And the secondary project metrics are usually the numerical representations of the primary one. So as I was talking about it, defects per unit, defects per million opportunities, the average age of the receivables, number of lines of error-free software code, reduction in the amount of scrap. So that's more practically what we're really going to be looking at. I would suggest that where possible, use percentages rather than full numbers. So rather than saying I want to reduce my freight costs from $1 million to $500,000, I might say, you know what, I want to reduce my freight costs as a percentage of sales from X to X2 to X1, because that metric might be that your freight expenses go up, or they might come down, independent of how well the process is performing based on sales volume. If sales volume increases, of course, freight charges are likely to increase. Similarly, if freight or sales go down, freight charges are likely to go down as well, independent of the process. Tying it to sales keeps it honest, keeps it consistent that way. We might find that someone comes to the project leader and says, hey, you're supposed to be working on a freight project, and we've noticed that despite all those improvements that you put in place that we thought sounded so good, our freight expenses have gone up by some percentage. Yes, they have. However, our sales have gone up by some much larger percentage. So we're actually doing much better as a percentage of sales. Our process is performing much better. It's just that the cost has gone up because sales has gone up. So think about your project why or your objective statement from that perspective. Consequential metrics measure the negative effects of improving the primary or key metrics. Sometimes maybe. All we have to do is say no to anybody that pays over 30 days, and lo and behold, our receivables improve, our days to pay improve, but we've also cut our sales in half. So, we don't want to cause harm. So we might have a constraining why. Consequential metric is another way to say that. Inconsistent use of consequential metrics can lead to a loss of opportunity and rework after a project ends. You might create a new project if you don't have a constraining why when you should have. So you've helped this element of the business, but you've harmed that element as a result. And so now you've got to do another project to deal with that other piece of it without, of course, harming the first project. So here's some examples. The project is carried out to increase the pace of introducing offers to customers, but in the current practice, releasing the offer at a faster pace will hamper the quality of the previous offer. Due to the current offer, the product will be degraded as overpriced, or it can be degraded, or can degrade the project margin from the upcoming offer as it will be underpriced. So here's the solution. Instead of increasing the pace of introducing offers and calling it as an improvement to the process, the team can create and introduce a new design or modify the process to benefit the organization. By increasing the pace of introducing offers, the project can show the profit it makes, but fails to record the loss and downfall of the previous offer. This is where consequential metrics help to understand the cause and effect relationships between the primary and secondary metrics and the impact it has on the organization. So again, we want to improve time, but we don't want to sacrifice quality. Pretty common issue. So here's how we create our why and constraining why. We want to improve time or reduce time, I guess it would be, to introduce a new offer from where we are currently to this new improved state without sacrificing quality as measured in this way. And we'd have to figure out how we're going to measure the quality. Some best practices to follow. Setting consequential metrics during the measure phase and monitoring these metrics after finalizing the project will help analyze whether the link between previous primary and secondary metrics has been established. Linking consequential metrics with primary metrics, and finally linking them to secondary metrics, providing clarity on the impact of these metrics. Assessing and evaluating the cause and effect relationship between these metrics is helpful to the organization as a whole. And typically what I would do is if the sponsor and I are having a conversation, if I'm the project leader at the outset of the project, and we're talking through the objective statement, we might come up with this on our own. I'm certainly going to vet it through the project team as well to make sure that they're on board with it. If they have any serious issues or they believe it needs to be changed or modified, then we would revisit that with the sponsor. It's unusual for that to happen. The sponsor, because they have the positional authority, they've probably been doing it a long time. Based on their experience and their position in the organization, should have a pretty good understanding of things. So between you and the sponsor, you're probably going to get it right. But again, it's important to vet it through your project team, and if there are any issues, then you can revisit that and maybe set up a conversation between the sponsor and the team. If your team and sponsor don't have a meeting to kick it off in the first place, which is often what happens. So in the team's kickoff meeting, you and the sponsor will come in. The sponsor will kind of kick off the meeting. Here's what we're working on. Here's why you've been invited to participate as a team member. Here's why it's so important. Here's the objective. Any questions, any issues, concerns, comments, all that sort of thing. That's the time and opportunity for that conversation to take place. Assuming that anything needs to be changed, you can address it at that point. But it's pretty unusual. Very, very rare, if ever, will that take place. Possible, but just not usual. And so you move forward. If the team buys into it, then everything is good, and you move forward with that, and that's the end of it. Now, the project manager is going to be able to use some different tools. And these are going to help you understand the work as you move forward and plan accordingly. So we've talked a little bit about the Pareto chart, and we'll look at some examples so you understand that one better and how to use it. We'll talk about the critical path method, the program evaluation review technique. Maybe PERT is easier to say. That is a mouthful. Talk about Gantt charts, work breakdown structures. There's also something called a RACI diagram. I'm not sure. I can't remember where that is. But it's another approach you can use. And if you haven't seen one, I've found that to be very useful. I like it personally quite a bit, the RACI diagram. Just another way to capture the work that's being done. the people involved, the timeline, and so on. Use the tool that makes sense, that you're comfortable with, that does the job that you need it to do. Now, I talked a little bit about the 80-20, the vital few, or the trivial many. It's really just a histogram depicting the frequency of occurrence of events. So it's going to plot all the causes for defects in a product or service, or whatever category or issue you're looking at. It's going to plot them in order of frequency, with those most frequent on the front end and those least frequently on the back end. So moving from left to right, on the far left-hand side against the y-axis, you would have those issues that happen most frequently, and in descending order all the way down to those least frequently. It not only shows you the count, but also the relative contribution of that element. So, for example, it might say for top 3 items, where one is 70, 20, and 10. The first bar would say have a count of 70. It's 70%. The next one has a count of 20. Now you're at 90%. Next one is a contribution of 10, and now you're at 100%. So it's going to show you all that information. Gives you a lot of information visually in a very easy to read and understand way. And quite often I have found that even though this was maybe beyond the scope of what Pareto had written, like Duran had sort of proposed, or at least hypothesized, that 80% of the effects often do come from 20% of the causes. Not always, but quite often. At the very least, a large number usually come from a small number of items. It's unusual to have a whole bunch of different things happening for a whole bunch of different reasons. So it narrows the scope of the project or problem solving by identifying the major causes affecting quality, or whatever process you're looking at, however you define it. And if you were doing some analysis and you were looking at, after collecting data for a particular issue, you might use a Pareto chart in that situation as well. So you can use it throughout the course of the project when it makes sense. And here's an excellent example of what it might look like. The hotel receives lots of complaints from the customers, and the hotel manager wishes to identify the key areas of complaints. So they've gone out and they've surveyed a whole bunch of people, or maybe they've talked to the front desk, and this is what they've captured, or however they've gone out and collected information from their guests or their customers, or however they're defined. They've captured different complaints. Looks like they've talked to a total of 64 people. 35 of those people mentioned cleaning as being a big issue. 19 mentioned check-in. 4 people pool timings. 3 people minibar, 2 room service, 1 other. Not sure what the other is. You see the relative contribution. So individually, cleaning was 54.69, check-in was 29.69, pool timing 6.25, and so on. Cumulatively, you can see cleaning 54.69, check-in now we're at 84.38, pool timing's 90.63. Well, just the top 2 items alone account for almost 85% of the complaints. So if I look at cleaning and check-in, and I address those 2 issues, just the 2 out of all the issues listed, I've just addressed almost 85% of the complaints. That's a pretty big hit for 2 items out of the number listed there. How much time and effort do I want to spend in the other ones? Depends on how much relative improvement I get from each. Depends on the cost and effort involved, and so on. So the team might say, you know what, to address pool timings, it's going to cost us nothing. It's going to be a few items. And you can see visually, again, I see a table and I can look and read that, but visually when I take a look at the graph, the Pareto chart, it's much easier to read. I get a lot of information, and immediately I see that, gosh, those 2 items really are the big hitters. I don't have to read through the table. So chart, very nice, easy easy to read. And I can see, how to read it. You can see that go on that first horizontal bar that the 35 complaints were to do with cleaning. Of 19, a little less than 2019, and so on. And you can see the relative percentage over here. So you can see that the first bar, if I follow the X over to the far right side, I see it's about halfway through between the 50 and the 60. If I had more resolution, I would see it more precisely, but I can see it's about 55, and so on. You get a pretty quick idea visually in a matter of about a second and a half of where your hitters are and what their contribution is. So a very, very powerful graph that I like quite a bit. Network diagrams, another approach that we can use, or an arrow diagram. Project planning tool uses arrows to connect activities and represents precedents and interdependencies between activities of a project. There are some assumptions that are made while drawing a network diagram. Before a new activity begins, all pending activities have been completed. The direction of the arrow represents the sequence that activities need to follow. And it must start from a single event and end with a single event. Different terms. So in order for the network diagram to calculate the total duration of the project manager, and when I say project manager, think of that as being synonymous with the belt, in this case a green belt. The project manager needs to define 4 dates for each task. Early start, in other words, the earliest date by when the task can be started. A late start, or the last date by when the task should be started. Early finish, the earliest date by when the task can be completed, and the late finish, which is the last date by when the task should be completed. So you've completed or calculated and defined, I suppose, those 4 dates for each task. 2 more terms related. Duration of the task, so the difference between an early start and an early finish of the task, and the slack time or float time for a task. The amount of time the task can be delayed before it causes a delay in the overall project timeline. There's also the critical path method, project planning tool used to monitor the progress of a project and ensure the project is on schedule. It's the longest sequence of tasks on the network diagram. So the critical path in the network diagram is highlighted in orange. The tasks on the critical path have 0 slack. Resources from tasks that are not on the critical path can be diverted to tasks on the critical path to ensure the project is not delayed. And it can have multiple critical paths. So any delay in one of these critical path elements will cause a delay in the entire project. There's also the PERT, or the Project Review Evaluation and Review Technique. And it's a form of a network diagram. We use it to identify the critical path for the project. So this technique developed to simplify the planning and scheduling of complex projects and creates a more realistic estimate of the duration of each activity. It uses 3 kinds of estimates for the duration of each activity. We've got the optimistic estimate, the most likely estimate, and the pessimistic estimate. So when we're looking at the optimistic estimate, we're looking at expecting all the factors, or expect all the factors that affect the activity go in favor of the activity, and is therefore slightly less than the other estimates. So that's the optimistic. Most likely assumes that the activity will encounter some issues during execution and hence provides for some contingency buffers in the estimate. And then there's the pessimistic estimate. That's assuming whatever that can go wrong during execution will go wrong. Murphy's Law, what can go wrong will go wrong. And so includes a large contingency buffer, the highest among all estimates. I'm just looking at where we're at with time. Okay. So here we have the realistic estimate of the activity, time for the estimate, and it's equal to time for the optimistic plus or time for the most likely, plus time for the pessimistic divided by 6, and that'll give you the realistic estimate of the activity. So we put those times in there, do our calculation, and it'll give us the realistic estimate of the activity. So that's a good way to project or forecast, maybe is a better way to say that, how long we think the activity will take. And there's a Gantt chart. So Gantt chart is going to provide a graphic method to schedule, plan, and control a project and record progress toward completion of various activities in that project. It's scheduled to represent as a bar chart spread over a timeline, and the baseline, actual completed, remaining duration, slack of a task are all indicated using bar length and color codes. And so you can see here an example. As time progresses, you can see how the activities flow over the course of the project. And so visually people can see, hey, here's where we're at today, here's where we're headed tomorrow, are we ahead of schedule, behind schedule, and so on. And we've got a legend here. So we can see our baseline duration, we can include any slack, what we've actually completed, remaining duration. So we can color code this as well. So in the example here we see the tasks A and B were completed on time. Task D is delayed by 1 day. Tasks B and C will start after completion of task A. Task F is dependent on task D, so a delay in task D will impact task F, and it'll finish a day late. Tasks which don't have a slack time are tasks on the critical path, so tasks B, D, and F are tasks on the critical path. So this is another way, and Gantt charts are used quite commonly. A good visual for you and your project team and any other project stakeholders that are invested in the project to take a look and see where you're at with it. And then we've got work breakdown structure. WBS is the acronym. And it's a delivery-oriented hierarchical decomposition of work used to define the total scope for the project and identify required deliverables for that project. So we have a project deliverable and work that's divided into small manageable components. We've got a work package, lowest level of the work breakdown structure, which can be scheduled, cost estimated, monitored, and controlled individually. So we see here in our example, we've got a telephone manufacturer project. The work breakdown structure includes everything which will form the final product. Anything not listed in that work breakdown structure will not be part of the final product, in this case the telephone. So you can see that we've got the telephone at the top. We've got an instrument box, which breaks down into keyboard, screen, and ringer. We've got wiring, which breaks down into handheld instrument or handheld instrument and phone to input mode. We've got circuits. Good way to visually represent different elements as well. Now, there's always going to be risk or some type of consequence, maybe something that is at stake. So risk is an uncertain event or consequence that will probably occur during a project. It impacts at least one of the 4 main project objectives: time, quality, cost, and scope. It can be positive and enhance the success of the project, as well as negative and pose a threat to the project's success. Something that you ought to be doing as a project leader throughout the course of the project is looking at different elements of it to assess the risk for work being done. What's the probability or the likelihood that a risk will occur? It's a probability, it's called. To assess any risk is to assess the probability impact of the risk. Something that you'll want to work on with the team as you think about it and maybe place, even though we think we've vetted it properly, and maybe we even did a pilot and it worked well, when we roll it out across the organization, for example, there are some risks associated with this. Here are the things that could potentially happen that either for the better or for the worse. And if those things happen, what are we going to do? What is our reaction plan? If you can proactively figure out what you and the team members will do if something happens, then you're better able to prepare for it, as opposed to having to scramble if something does happen. And quite often through a project, something will take place that was unanticipated, or there was a risk associated with it and it didn't happen. So if you're prepared for it, then you can react much more quickly. Particularly if you've got some type of a plan in place. If this happens, this is what's going to be done, here's who's going to do it, and so on. Excuse me. So the risk analysis and management is going to be obviously crucial to the successful project. And it's really a 5-step process. So you're going to identify the risk, you're going to evaluate it, you're going to prioritize and prevent, you're going to implement, monitor, and control. So as you're going through and identifying the risk, potential risks are identified using qualitative techniques like interview, brainstorming, and check sheets. Evaluating risk, identified potential risks are evaluated using the quantitative methods under the 3 criteria from the FMEA: occurrence, severity, and detection. Identified risks are prioritized based on their RPN, or risk priority number. Counter or prevention measures for the risk are brainstormed. When we go through the implement, the identified countermeasures are going to be implemented if they need to be. Hopefully you won't need to, but better safe than sorry. So if something does happen, you can implement or will implement. And then the whole project will be monitored and controlled so that the risk and its impact are under control. So we're going to go through that 5-step process with you and the team. So some of the elements of risk analysis are as follows. So if we're looking at the qualitative method, interviews, checklists, brainstorming used to identify potential risks. We've got the quantitative method used to evaluate the cost, time, probabilistic combination of individual uncertainties. The feasibility, or the study of the project risk, the potential impact, determining the impact of potential risks on the project, or that element of the project may be one of the improvements. You've got that RPN, or the risk priority number of a failure, which is the product of its probability of occurrence, severity, and detectability. We've got avoiding risk, which if the potential risk impact is huge, then avoiding the risk is the best option. Something you and the team will have to decide, and the sponsor possibly as well. Mitigating risk, the loss from mitigating a risk is much less than the loss from temporarily avoiding the risk. Accepting risk. If it can't be avoided or mitigated, then it has to be accepted. The risk will be accepted if it doesn't greatly impact the cost, time, and product objective. So you and your team will go through and think about the things that could potentially happen. You'll calculate the severity, the occurrence, and the detectability, that RPN, and you'll think about, if these things happen, what do we do? What are the consequences? What do we do? Is it worth the risk involved? Yes or no? And make a decision and recommendation, presumably to the sponsor. You might even, if you've got a management review group, you might even bring it to that group as well, because they might appreciate making the final call on something like that. Now, a number of benefits of risk analysis. I mean, it's probably common sense that, or self-evident at least, that this is really important. But identified risks can be mitigated, transferred, or accepted. At least if you have that conversation with you and your team members and you identify them, then there's something that you can do about it. You're not having to react when it was unanticipated. And then it's, crisis management. That's not a good position to be in. When risk is identified in a task, slack time is provided as a buffer. So identifying risks will help in setting up actual timeline for a project. Identifying risks helps in setting realistic expectations from the project by communicating the risk probability and consequence to stakeholders. And contingency plans can be developed for identified risks. So the project team can be prepared to work on the issue and reduce the impact of the risk. So if you've identified it, you believe that it's acceptable to take on that risk because it isn't severe enough to cause enough harm to avoid moving forward or implementing an improvement, for example, then you think about, okay, well, we're going to move forward. We accept that there's a risk. We're prepared for it, and here's what we anticipate that we, if it happens, here's what we'll do. And again, all those pieces are spelled out and identified and defined in detail so that when we move forward, if that failure or if that risk occurs, if something happens, that you can act on it immediately and effectively. People know what to do because they're prepared, and you're not surprising anybody. If you're putting in a new computer system, you're probably not going to have a light switch event where you shut down your old system and turn on your new system and hope it all works, because the risk is that if the new system doesn't turn on and operate properly, your business could be shut down for some period of time. So you might say, look, to mitigate that risk, what we're willing to do is to have the two systems operate at the same time. So there's overlap, so we can make sure that the new system is operating as anticipated and as expected. And once that's been determined, then we can, turn off the old machine, but not until that's taken place. So that might be an example of something you might do. Here's a very good matrix that you can use for risk assessments, where you can look at the areas of potential risks and their effects. You can look at, everything from, scope of the project to the team to the personnel to communication and so on. Whatever else might make sense, you can include that. Again, that's in your toolkit, so you can edit and adjust this to make sense for your circumstances. And then you can look at things like risk of monetary loss, high, medium, and low, risk of productivity loss, high, medium, low, risk of resources, risk of customer confidence loss. You could add more columns or change these. You could, instead of high, medium, low, you could use maybe a 1 to 5 scale. You can play with it as you determine is appropriate for your needs. But again, this is a very effective approach and makes you and the team think about the potential areas that we need to be aware of. Now, the good news is that at the end of the project, I would expect that you'll be able to celebrate. So every project is going to require closure, and that's the time to celebrate. Once closure's been approved, that'll be a good thing. Without a formal closure, project teams can fail to recognize the end, and the project drags on, sometimes at great expense. So there probably ought to be some formal method in place or mechanism in place to say, okay, here's where we define the end of the project. And you'll probably set out at the beginning of it with some type of objective in mind. We expect to get from here to there, and as you go through the define, the measure, analyze, approve, control, you put together your control plan, which we'll talk about on Friday in detail. And you've handed off the process to the process owner, who will now manage it on a daily basis going forward. And you've been able to establish that we've improved this process by either increasing something from here to there or decreasing something from there to here without consequence or unintended consequences maybe. And as a result of that, you've gone to the sponsor, and presumably the management review group is informed as well. You say, we're ready to close this, we need your approval. And so the sponsor will say yes or no. Yes, you've met the objectives. Yes, you can close. That's great work, great job. You presumably go through either a black belt or quite often it would be the master black belt, and maybe captured. The team should feel a sense of completion. You don't have people saying, well, gosh, we're not really done yet. We haven't done all this other stuff that we really thought we needed to do. If that's the case, then the sponsor would say yay or nay. And that project resources can now be released for new projects. So presumably, you've gotten to where you needed to go. Everybody everybody's on board with it. The team is pretty excited. The business has improved significantly because of the project, and you can validate that with statistical tests that you've done to show it isn't likely to happen by chance. And that now that because of all of those great things that you've done and you're ready to celebrate, the team will have, whether everybody gets a shirt with Six Sigma logo on it, or you all go out and have lunch or dinner, you get a team bag or a coat or something like that, or maybe it's just, a sponsor signs a certificate and has a presentation ceremony for the project team at the closing meeting. In any event, you're done with the project, you disband. Yeah, the project belt probably will go on and maybe work on another project. And maybe those team members, if they're not belts, will want to become belts. That's quite common as well, where someone's been part of the project team, they really like the process, and they said, hey, I'd like to know how to lead a project, I'd like to do this as well. I'd like to go through the training and be able to use these tools for my part of the business as well. That's very common. And so all that can take place. So you're going to create a project closure report, and because it needs to accomplish some things. You're going to review and validate the success of the project, generate project closure recommendations. Maybe there were some spin-off project opportunities. Maybe there are some other recommendations that have to be made or should be made. Confirm outstanding issues, limitations, and recommendations. Generate discussion recommendations. Provide a synopsis of the process, and so on. So these are some of the things that you will do. That's actually a pretty comprehensive list, but these are some of the things that you will do as part of your project closure report. Typically, what I would like to see in a project closure report, in addition to being able to establish that here's what your objective was. You said you'd go from here to there. Yes, you did. You ran some tests to validate that you in fact did do that. That level of improvement or the magnitude of improvement isn't likely to happen by chance. At least the chance of it happening is remote. You've got the tests to prove that. You've got an effective and well-documented control plan in place. The team members are all on board with this. They've all signed off on it. The sponsor's happy. You can document how much money the project has generated for the business. And it's not just your say-so or the team members say-so. You've vetted that through finance, and they've signed off saying, yes, this project created this much money for the business, and we attest to that. I mean, that's the kind of stuff you probably want to make, and there might be some recommendations through the course of the project. We found some spin-up project opportunities. We found that although it was outside of the scope of the project, this was an issue, and we didn't know an answer for it. And because it was outside of the scope, we recommend this be put into the project hopper and be considered as a future project. So that's all the kind of stuff in the final report that you probably want to see. Every organization will be a little different. And so you do what makes sense for your organization, whatever the protocol happens to be. But again, this slide lists pretty nicely some of the stuff that you would want to include in your report. And some of the activities, and we've touched on these as well, but I'll touch on a few more of them. Where you're finalizing the project documents, you're making a public announcement. Pretty good idea to say, we did, based on this customer feedback, we put a team together and we made these improvements to the business, and it's generated this much improvement, and we're pretty excited about this, and congratulations to these team members for their hard work and for everyone that made this possible. Be vocal and liberal in your recognition of people. People should feel good for having participated, even if it was in a small way. Let everybody know they helped and made the project success possible. And it's not a bad idea to advertise back to your customer base that provided the input for the project. Hey, we've listened to you, we've heard you, we've made an investment, here's what we've come up with. We wanted to let you know how much we valued your feedback, and we do act on it. Nobody wants to put feedback into a black hole, and you've taken the time to do a survey, and you've said a bunch of stuff, and you never hear about it again, and nothing seems to change. You feel like they've wasted your time, they've taken advantage of your goodwill, and if anything, it maybe even creates some harm for the business because you have disengaged customers that feel badly because they've been somewhat disrespected. this avoids that. Let them know that you've heard them and you've done something about it. Recognize and reward, and so on. So this is a good slide in terms of thinking about your closing the project. We need to make sure that we do this stuff. And I alluded to, before I forget, while we're on the slide, I alluded before having a repository within the organization, within the business, that captures information about projects that have been done. And so if you set up a project library, it becomes really helpful because it enables other people within the organization to go to this library and say, hey, I've got a problem in my business. Has someone else done a project like this before me? And for an organization that has, a large number of projects that have been done, hundreds or even possibly thousands of projects, then that might very well be the case. So I was looking at productivity in a particular area of the business, and I work over here in this department. Well, maybe there are other locations that have exactly the same problem that I had at the beginning. They may even be a different area of the business that have, they do different work, but fundamentally it was the same problem. And so they can learn from my project. Rather than having to reinvent the wheel, they can review the work that I've done or the team has done and maybe have a conversation with me or with us, and they can learn from what we've done and expedite their project, do it more efficiently, more effectively than otherwise they could have done. So instead of taking 5 or 6 months, maybe they can cut the cycle time for the project down to 3 or 4 months because they can follow our roadmap. That's maybe one of the most valuable aspects of keeping a repository. It's not just to keep a history of stuff you've done, a bunch of documents that no one looks at. It's to learn from what others have done before you. Any questions about what we've covered so far in this lesson or today generally? No questions? Okay. I have almost half past the hour. Now is probably a good time to break. I know there's been a lot of information today. We're a little bit ahead of schedule at the moment, but that's a good thing because some of the other modules will maybe take a little longer to go through than this one did as we go through some of the examples, and I'm sure we will have some questions. And so, being able to get a little bit ahead is a good thing for us. But I don't want to get too far ahead just because the next topic coming up, and it's late in the day, I'm sure your minds are getting tired, and that's to be expected. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask now, or think about it overnight, and tomorrow morning feel free to ask first thing.
Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you. Have a good night, and I will talk to you all tomorrow.
Thank you, Mark. Good day.
Nice.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you. You too.